Hello, friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the swirling white, and Asa Merriweather kept both hands locked on the wheel as the rig crawled forward at 30 miles per hour. He'd been hauling freight for 17 years, and he'd driven through snowstorms in 10 different states, but this one felt different. The flakes weren't falling so much as swarming, thick and wet, plastering the windshield faster than the wipers could clear them. The defroster roared at full blast, filling the cab with dry heat that smelled faintly of diesel and old coffee. Outside, the world had collapsed into a monochrome blur of darkness and motion. The route had seemed straightforward when he'd left the distribution center in Fargo that morning. A 12-hour haul west into Montana, skirting the northern edge of the Rockies, delivering industrial supplies to a mining operation near a town called Ashfall. The dispatcher had mentioned weather moving in, but the forecast hadn't looked serious. Light snow, maybe some wind. Nothing a seasoned driver couldn't handle. But somewhere around the state line, the light snow had thickened into a full squall, and the wind had picked up until it buffeted the trailer hard enough to make the whole rig shudder. Asa had considered pulling over, waiting it out at a truck stop, but the GPS showed nothing for another 40 miles. So he'd kept going, counting on the weight of the load to keep him stable. Now, 2 hours past sunset, he was regretting that decision. The highway had narrowed as it climbed into the foothills, and the guardrails had disappeared entirely in places, replaced by orange reflector posts that flickered past like dying embers. The CB radio crackled with static and the occasional burst of garbled voices, truckers farther east complaining about road conditions and closures. Asa had tried calling in twice, asking if anyone had recent intel on the pass ahead, but no one had answered. Either the storm was jamming the signal, or he was the only one dumb enough to be out here tonight. The road curved sharply to the left, and Asa downshifted, feeling the engine grind as the grade steepened. The tires found purchase on what felt like packed snow over asphalt, and the rig inched upward. He glanced at the fuel gauge, 3/4 full. Plenty to get him through as long as the road didn't close entirely. The dashboard clock read 9:47 p.m. If he could make it over the pass and down the other side, he'd hit Ashfall by midnight, maybe a little after. Unload in the morning, grab a hot meal, and get some sleep before heading back. The trees closed in on both sides. Tall pines weighted down with snow, their branches sagging like old shoulders. In the headlights, they looked almost skeletal, and the spaces between them were absolute black. Asa felt the familiar loneliness of the long haul settle over him, that strange mix of solitude and alertness that came with driving through the night. He'd always liked it in a way. No traffic, no distractions, just the hum of the engine and the rhythm of the road. But tonight, the loneliness felt heavier. The storm pressed in from all sides, muffling sound, swallowing distance. It was like driving through the inside of a cloud. He reached for the thermos wedged between the seats and took a sip of lukewarm coffee. Bitter and stale, but it helped. He was thinking about turning on the radio, finding some talk show or late-night music to fill the silence, when the CB crackled to life. "Bridge ahead, repeat, bridge ahead, conditions uncertain." The voice was male, roughened by static, and it cut out before finishing. Asa grabbed the handset, keyed it. "This is southbound 43, come back on that bridge warning. What's the location?" Silence, just the hiss of dead air. He tried again. "Anyone copy? Need confirmation on bridge conditions." Nothing. He hung the handset back on its clip and squinted through the windshield. The road ahead looked the same, a narrow ribbon of white curving upward into the dark. No signs, no markers, but if there was a bridge coming up, he needed to know about it. Bridges iced over faster than regular road, especially in a storm like this. And if it was an old one, narrow or poorly maintained, he might be in trouble. He checked the GPS. The screen showed the highway as a thin blue line, winding through a blank expanse of topographic green. No bridge marked, but that didn't mean much. Half the infrastructure out here was older than the satellites tracking it, built in the 30s and 40s when the mountain towns were logging hubs. Some of those old spans didn't even show up on modern maps. The grade leveled out slightly, and the trees thinned. Asa felt the wind hit the trailer broadside, a solid gust that pushed the rig a foot to the left. He corrected, easing off the throttle. The last thing he needed was to lose traction and slide into the ditch. He'd seen it happen to other drivers, good ones too, guys who'd been hauling twice as long as he had. One mistake, one patch of black ice, and you were done. The CB crackled again. This time, the voice was clearer, though still threaded with static. If you're heading west on Route 14, be advised, Meridian Bridge is down to 1 lane. Road crews got it blocked off for ice removal. You'll need to wait for clearance. Asa keyed the handset. Copy that. This is southbound 43. How long's the wait? A pause, then, depends on conditions. Could be 20 minutes, could be an hour. They're chipping ice off the deck. It's bad up there. Understood. Any alternate routes? Another pause, longer this time. Negative. Meridian's the only way through unless you want to backtrack 60 miles. Your call. Asa cursed under his breath. 60 miles back would put him hours behind schedule, and with the storm worsening, there was no guarantee the other route would be any better. He'd have to take his chances with the bridge. Copy. I'll take the wait. Thanks for the heads up. Stay safe out there, the voice said, and then the line went dead. Asa set the handset down and rubbed his eyes. His back ached from the tension of gripping the wheel, and his shoulders felt like they'd been clamped in a vise. He rolled his neck, heard it pop, and took another sip of coffee. Cold now, but it didn't matter. He needed the caffeine more than the warmth. The road ahead began to descend, and Asa felt the rig pick up speed. He tapped the brakes lightly, keeping the engine brake engaged. The tires hissed against the packed snow, and the trailer swayed slightly as the grade steepened. He could see the trees thinning further now, opening up into what looked like a valley. And then, through the swirling snow, he saw it. The bridge. It rose out of the darkness like a skeleton, all iron and rust, spanning a deep gorge that disappeared into the blackness below. The deck was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 lanes, and the railings were old-fashioned, just waist-high iron bars that looked like they'd snap if you breathed on them wrong. Orange cones lined the approach, funneling traffic into a single lane, and a cluster of yellow lights flickered near the far end. Work lights, Asa guessed. The road crew the CB voice had mentioned. He slowed to a crawl, pulling up behind a line of reflective cones. The bridge stretched ahead, maybe 300 feet long, its iron lattice structure layered with snow and ice. The wind howled through the open framework, and Asa could hear the faint creak of metal, a sound that set his teeth on edge. He'd crossed plenty of old bridges in his career, but this one looked like it had been standing since before the war, maybe even before that. He stopped the rig about 50 feet from the bridge entrance and set the air brakes. The engine idled, a low rumble that vibrated through the cab. Ahead, he could see the work lights more clearly now. They were mounted on tripods, casting harsh yellow pools across the icy deck. But he didn't see any crew. No trucks, no workers in reflective vests, no one chipping ice or waving traffic through. Asa frowned. He grabbed the CB handset. This is southbound 43 at Meridian Bridge. I'm in position, but I don't see any road crew. Anyone got eyes on them? Static. He waited, then tried again. Road crew at Meridian, come in. I'm at the south approach, waiting for clearance. Nothing, just the hiss of dead air and the howl of the wind outside. Asa set the handset down and stared at the bridge. The work lights were definitely on, which meant someone had set them up recently. But where were they? He scanned the deck, the far end, the banks on either side. No movement, no vehicles. Just the lights and the snow and the empty span. He considered his options. He could wait here, hope the crew showed up or radioed back. He could try calling them on his cell, assuming he had service, which he probably didn't. Or he could inch forward, take a closer look, see if maybe they were on the far side, out of view. Before he could decide, something caught his eye. A flicker of movement near the far end of the bridge, just beyond the reach of the work lights. A figure, dark and indistinct, standing near the railing. Asa leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. The snow made it hard to see clearly, but the figure was definitely there. It looked like a person, bundled in a heavy coat, maybe waving. Or was it just standing still? The snow swirled, and the figure seemed to blur, then solidify again. Asa grabbed the handset. "Road crew, is that you at the north end? I see someone near the railing." No response. He tried again. "If you can hear me, I'm coming across. Give me a signal if you need help." Still nothing. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless, except for the occasional shift that might have been the wind tugging at its coat. Asa felt a prickle of unease. Something about this didn't feel right. The empty bridge, the silent radio, the solitary figure in the snow. But what choice did he have? He couldn't sit here all night, and he couldn't turn back. He'd have to cross eventually. He released the air brakes and eased the rig forward. The tires crunched over packed snow, and the trailer creaked as it followed. The bridge deck was coated in a thin layer of ice, visible even through the snow, and Asa felt the tires slip slightly before finding grip. He kept his speed low, barely 10 miles per hour, and focused on keeping the rig centered in the lane. The iron framework loomed on either side, a latticework of rusted beams and cross supports that looked like they were holding the whole structure together through sheer stubbornness. The wind screamed through the open spaces, buffeting the trailer and making the whole rig shudder. Below, Asa could see nothing but darkness, a void so deep it felt like it was pulling at him. He was halfway across when he saw the tracks. They were faint, almost buried under fresh snow, but unmistakable. Tire tracks, wide and deep, like another truck had crossed recently. But they didn't lead all the way to the far end. They stopped about 2/3 of the way across, right in the middle of the lane, and then they just ended. No skid marks, no sign of swerving, just a clean stop, as if the truck had vanished into thin air. Asa's heart began to pound. He slowed even further, almost to a stop, and stared at the tracks. They were fresh. The snow was still loose around the edges, not packed down by wind, which meant they'd been made within the last hour, maybe less. But where had the truck gone? There was nowhere to turn around, nowhere to pull off, and the tracks didn't continue to the far end. He glanced up at the figure near the railing. It was closer now, or maybe it had moved. Hard to tell. It still wasn't waving, wasn't signaling, just standing there watching. Asa's instincts screamed at him to turn around, to back off the bridge and find another route, schedule be damned. But the rational part of his brain pushed back. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the other truck had turned around somehow, or maybe the tracks were older than they looked, already half buried by the storm. And the figure was probably just a worker, tired and cold, waiting for the shift to end. He eased the rig forward again, inching past the spot where the tracks ended. The bridge creaked beneath him, a long, low groan that seemed to come from deep within the iron framework. Asa gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. The work lights were just ahead now, close enough that he could see the tripods they were mounted on, and beyond them the figure. It was a man, Asa realized. Tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy parka with the hood pulled up. He stood with his back to the railing, facing the bridge, and his hands were stuffed in his pockets. He didn't move as Asa approached, didn't wave or step aside. He just stood there, perfectly still, like a statue. Asa rolled down his window a crack. The wind roared in, bringing a blast of icy air and snow. He shouted over the noise. "You the road crew? Is it safe to cross?" The man didn't respond, didn't even turn his head. Asa felt the unease sharpen into something colder, something closer to fear. He was about to shout again when the CB crackled to life. "Turn around." The voice was low, urgent, barely audible over the static. Asa grabbed the handset. "Say again, turn around. Get off the bridge, now." Asa's pulse spiked. He looked at the figure again. It still hadn't moved. And now, as he stared, he realized something else. The man wasn't standing on the deck. He was standing just beyond the railing, on the other side, suspended over the void. Asa's breath caught in his throat. He slammed the rig into reverse, but the tires spun on the ice, finding no purchase. The trailer fishtailed slightly, and the whole rig shuddered. He tried again, easing off the clutch, but the wheels just spun faster, throwing up sprays of snow and slush. The CB crackled again. "You need to move, don't stop." "I'm trying," Asa shouted back. "The ice. Forward. Go forward. Don't look back." Asa's hands shook as he shifted into first gear. The tires caught, and the rig lurched forward. He didn't look at the figure as he passed, didn't let himself think about what he'd seen. He just focused on the road ahead, on the far end of the bridge, on getting off this goddamn span and back onto solid ground. The work lights flickered as he passed beneath them, and for a moment everything went dark. The headlights cut through the blackness, illuminating nothing but snow and iron. And then the lights flared back on, brighter than before, almost blinding. Asa reached the far end of the bridge and felt the tires hit solid asphalt. The rig rolled forward, off the deck and onto the road beyond. He didn't stop. He kept going, pushing the rig up to 40, then 50, until the bridge was a distant glow in his mirrors. It wasn't until he was a mile down the road that he realized the CB had gone silent. No static, no voices, just dead air. He tried keying the handset, but nothing happened. The radio was off. Asa pulled over at the first turnout he found, a wide patch of gravel beside the road. He killed the engine and sat in the cab, shaking. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, and his hands wouldn't stop trembling. He looked in the side mirror, back toward the bridge, but all he could see was darkness and snow. After a long moment, he picked up the handset and tried the radio again. This time, it crackled to life. Static, and then a voice, different from before, younger, calmer. "Bridge is now clear for westbound traffic. Repeat, Meridian Bridge is clear. Road crew has finished ice removal. Proceed with caution." Asa stared at the handset. The voice sounded like it was reading from a script, like an automated message. But he'd heard another voice earlier, someone warning him to turn around, someone who'd known he was on the bridge. He set the handset down and rubbed his face. Maybe he'd imagined it. Maybe the stress and the storm and the lack of sleep had gotten to him. Or maybe there was something else going on, something he didn't want to think about. He started the engine and pulled back onto the road. The storm was easing now, the snow thinning to light flurries. The trees on either side of the road looked normal, no longer skeletal and menacing. just trees. And ahead, the lights of Ashfall glowed faintly on the horizon. Asa drove in silence. The CB turned low, the only sound the hum of the engine and the hiss of tires on wet pavement. He didn't look back. He didn't want to see the bridge again, didn't want to think about the figure standing beyond the railing, or the tire tracks that ended in the middle of the span, or the voice that had told him to run. By the time he reached Ashfall, it was nearly midnight. He unloaded the cargo in the morning as planned, grabbed a hot meal at a diner on Main Street, and tried to sleep in a motel room that smelled of bleach and stale cigarettes. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bridge, the iron framework, the work lights, the figure in the snow, and he heard the voice on the CB. Don't stop. Don't look back. He never took that route again. Asa didn't sleep that night in Ashfall. He lay on the motel bed with his boots still on, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles and listening to the radiator clank and hiss in the corner. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bridge. The figure standing beyond the railing. The tire tracks that ended in nothing. He tried to convince himself it was exhaustion, that the storm and the isolation had played tricks on his mind, but the explanation felt hollow. He'd been driving long enough to know the difference between fatigue and something real. At 5 a.m, he gave up on sleep entirely. He showered in lukewarm water that smelled faintly of sulfur, dressed in yesterday's clothes, and headed down to the diner across the street. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of locals nursing coffee at the counter, and a waitress who looked like she'd been working the graveyard shift for the past 20 years. Asa took a booth by the window and ordered eggs, toast, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. While he waited, he pulled out his phone and searched for information on Meridian Bridge. The cell service was spotty, but he managed to load a few results. Most of what he found was local history, old newspaper articles about the bridge's construction in 1938, and a few mentions of routine maintenance over the decades. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained what he'd seen. Then he found something else. A forum post from 3 years ago, buried in a trucker's message board he'd never heard of. The title read, Meridian Bridge. Anyone else had weird experiences? Asa clicked on it, his pulse quickening. The original poster, username RoadDog57, had written a short account. He'd been crossing Meridian Bridge on a winter night in 2019 when his CB had started picking up strange transmissions, voices warning him to turn around to get off the bridge. He'd ignored them, thinking it was interference from a nearby radio tower, but halfway across his engine had stalled. No reason, no warning. He'd sat there for 20 minutes, trying to restart it, while the wind howled through the iron framework and snow piled up on his windshield. When the engine finally caught, he'd floored it off the bridge and never looked back. The replies were mixed. A few people said they'd had similar experiences, radios cutting out, engines stalling, the feeling of being watched. Others dismissed it as superstition, blamed it on old infrastructure and bad weather. But one reply stood out. It was from a user called Mountain Hauler, posted just 6 months ago. I know a guy who used to work road maintenance up there. He told me they stopped doing night shifts on Meridian after a crew went missing in the 80s. They found the truck the next morning, parked in the middle of the bridge, doors open, no one inside. The crew was never found. The state quietly changed the work schedule after that. No one talks about it, but the locals know. Asa set his phone down as the waitress brought his food. His appetite was gone, but he forced himself to eat. He needed fuel, needed to keep his mind sharp, because now he had a decision to make. He could head back the way he'd come, take the long route around the mountains and avoid Meridian Bridge entirely. Or he could push forward, take the same road out of Ashfall that every other trucker used, and cross that bridge again in daylight. The smart move was to go around. But the long route would add 6 hours to his trip, and he was already behind schedule, The dispatcher wouldn't be happy, and Asa couldn't afford to lose this contract. He'd been hauling for the same company for 5 years, and the pay was good, but they had a reputation for cutting drivers who couldn't keep up. He finished his coffee, paid the check, and walked back to the motel. The sky was beginning to lighten, a dull gray creeping over the mountains. The storm had passed, leaving behind a blanket of fresh snow that glittered in the streetlights. Asa climbed into his rig, started the engine, and sat for a long moment, hands on the wheel, staring at the road ahead. Finally, he made his choice. He'd cross the bridge again, in daylight. With the storm over and visibility clear, he'd be able to see everything, confirm that what he'd encountered the night before had been nothing more than shadows and exhaustion. He'd prove to himself that there was a rational explanation, and then he'd move on. He pulled out of the motel parking lot and headed east, retracing the route he'd taken the night before. The roads were clearer now, plowed and salted, and the rig moved easily through the mountain passes. The sun was rising behind him, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Everything looked different in the light. Normal. Safe. It took him an hour to reach the approach to Meridian Bridge. As he crested the final rise and the bridge came into view, Asa felt his chest tighten. The structure looked just as he remembered it. An old iron span rising out of the valley, its lattice framework dark against the white snow. But in daylight it looked smaller somehow. Less menacing. Just an old bridge, one of hundreds he'd crossed over the years. There were no work lights this time, no cones blocking the lane. The road was open, and Asa could see clear across to the far side. No figure standing near the railing, no mysterious tire tracks, just an empty bridge waiting to be crossed. He slowed as he approached, scanning the deck for any sign of what he'd seen the night before. The ice had been scraped away, leaving patches of bare metal and asphalt. The railings were intact, waist-high and solid, nothing beyond them but empty air and the gorge below. Asa eased the rig onto the bridge, keeping his speed low, and focused on the road ahead. The wind was calmer now, just a light breeze that barely moved the snow on the railings. The bridge creaked beneath the weight of the rig, but it was a familiar sound, the kind of noise old structures made when they bore a load. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. Halfway across, Asa glanced to his right, toward the spot where he'd seen the figure the night before. The railing was empty. No one standing there, no impossible silhouette suspended over the void. Just rusted iron and open air. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It had been his imagination. The storm, the darkness, the isolation, all of it had combined to create something that wasn't there. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed by a faint embarrassment. He'd let himself get spooked like a rookie. But then he saw it, scratched into the metal railing, just below the top bar, was a name. Fresh, the metal still bright where it had been scraped away. Asa hit the brakes, bringing the rig to a stop. He stared at the railing, his heart pounding. The name was carved in rough, uneven letters, like someone had used a knife or a piece of broken metal. Doyle Kincannon. Asa's breath caught. He didn't recognize the name, but something about it felt wrong. He grabbed his phone and took a picture of the railing, zooming in to capture the letters. Then he pulled up the search bar and typed in the name. The results loaded slowly, the cell signal weak this high in the mountains. But after a moment, a news article appeared. The headline read, "Local road worker missing after winter storm." Asa clicked on the link. The article was dated February 1987. It described how a road maintenance worker named Doyle Kincannon had disappeared during a night shift on Meridian Bridge. He'd been part of a crew clearing ice from the deck when a sudden storm rolled in. The other workers had taken shelter in their truck. But Kincannon had stayed on the bridge, insisting he needed to finish securing the work lights. When the storm passed and they went to find him, he was gone. No body was ever recovered. Asa stared at the screen, his hands trembling. The name on the railing was the same man who'd disappeared nearly 40 years ago. But the scratches in the metal were fresh. He could see where the rust had been scraped away, exposing bright steel underneath. He set the phone down and looked at the railing again. And that's when he noticed something else. Below the name, almost hidden in the shadow of the lower bar, were more scratches. Not words, but numbers. A date, 02/14/1987. The night Doyle Kincannon disappeared. Asa felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced in the mirror, half expecting to see the figure from the night before standing behind the rig. But the bridge was empty. No one there but him. He was about to release the brakes and keep moving when the CB crackled to life. "You shouldn't have stopped." The voice was the same one he'd heard the night before, low and urgent, roughened by static. Asa grabbed the handset, his pulse spiking. "Who is this? Identify yourself." No response, just the hiss of dead air. Then the voice came again, quieter this time. "Get off the bridge while you still can." Asa's hands moved on instinct. He shifted into gear, released the brakes, and pressed down on the accelerator. The tires spun for a moment on the icy deck, then caught. The rig lurched forward, and Asa focused on the far end of the bridge, refusing to look at the railing again. But as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The air in the cab felt colder, and he could hear a faint sound beneath the rumble of the engine. A rhythmic tapping, like metal on metal. It seemed to be coming from somewhere behind him, from the trailer. Asa checked the mirrors. The trailer was secure, the doors latched, nothing visibly wrong. But the tapping continued, steady and deliberate. 3 taps, then a pause. 3 more taps, over and over. He reached the far end of the bridge and felt the tires hit solid ground. The tapping stopped immediately. Asa pulled over at the first turnout, his heart hammering in his chest. He killed the engine and sat in silence, listening. Nothing. No tapping. No voices on the CB. Just the wind and the distant sound of traffic on the highway below. After a long moment, he climbed out of the cab and walked back to the trailer. The doors were locked, the seals intact. He ran his hand along the side of the trailer, checking for damage, but everything looked normal. No scratches, no dents. Nothing to explain the sound he'd heard. He was about to climb back into the cab when he noticed something on the ground. Footprints in the snow, leading from the back of the trailer to the edge of the turnout. They were fresh, the snow still loose around the edges. And they weren't his. The prints were too small, the tread pattern different from his boots. Asa followed the prints with his eyes. They led to the edge of the turnout, then stopped at the guardrail. Beyond the rail was a steep drop, a rocky slope covered in snow and ice. There was no way down, no path, just a sheer drop into the valley below. He looked back at the prints, then at the trailer. Someone had been standing there right next to his rig. But when? He'd been driving for the past 5 minutes, and before that, he'd been stopped on the bridge. No one could have approached without him seeing. Unless they'd been there all along. Asa felt his stomach twist. He scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement, but the turnout was deserted. Just him, the rig, and the footprints leading to nowhere. He climbed back into the cab, locked the doors, and started the engine. He didn't wait. He pulled back onto the road and kept driving, pushing the rig faster than he should have on the icy pavement. He needed distance. Needed to put as many miles as possible between himself and that bridge. It wasn't until he was an hour down the road, safely in the next valley that he allowed himself to think about what had happened. The name on the railing, the date, the voice on the CB, the footprints. None of it made sense, and yet all of it felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to solve. He pulled into a truck stop just before noon, parked in a spot near the building where he could see the entrance, and went inside. The place was busy, filled with drivers grabbing lunch and restocking supplies. Asa ordered a sandwich and sat at a corner table, his back to the wall, and pulled out his phone. He searched for more information on Doyle Kincannon, but there wasn't much beyond the original article. A few mentions in local history forums, a brief obituary that listed him as presumed deceased. No follow-up stories, no updates. Just a man who'd disappeared on a winter night and was never found. Asa set the phone down and rubbed his face. He wanted to believe there was a rational explanation. Maybe someone had carved the name on the railing as a memorial, and the scratches just looked fresh because the weather had worn away the rust. Maybe the voice on the CB had been another driver, someone playing a prank or trying to warn him about road conditions. Maybe the footprints had been his own, and he'd just forgotten making them. But deep down, he knew none of that was true. He finished his sandwich without tasting it, paid the check, and walked back to the rig. Before climbing in, he did another walk-around, checking the trailer, the tires, the undercarriage. Everything looked normal. But when he reached the passenger side, he stopped. There, on the side mirror, was a thin layer of frost. Not unusual in itself. The temperature was still below freezing. But the frost had formed in a pattern. Letters traced in the ice as if someone had drawn them with a finger. Turn back. Asa stared at the mirror, his breath visible in the cold air. The letters were clear, unmistakable, and they were fresh. The frost around them was still loose, not yet hardened by the wind. He looked around the parking lot. Dozens of trucks, drivers coming and going, but no one near his rig. No one who could have written the message. He reached out and wiped the frost away with his glove, erasing the letters. Then he climbed into the cab, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot. He didn't look back. He didn't want to see if the message reappeared. For the next 2 hours, Asa drove in silence. The CB was off, the radio turned low. He kept his eyes on the road and his hands steady on the wheel. The landscape gradually flattened as he descended from the mountains, the snow giving way to rain and then to clear skies. By mid-afternoon, he was back in familiar territory, the kind of open highway where you could see for miles in every direction. But the unease didn't leave. It sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold. Because he knew, deep in a place he didn't want to acknowledge, that what had happened on Meridian Bridge wasn't over. The name on the railing, the voice on the CB, the footprints, the message in the frost. They were all connected, all part of something he didn't understand. And the worst part was, he had a feeling he'd be going back. Not by choice, but because the route required it. Because Meridian Bridge was the only way through those mountains, and sooner or later, he'd have to cross it again. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the highway, Asa made a decision. The next time he had a haul that required crossing Meridian Bridge, he'd take the long route. He didn't care how many hours it added, didn't care what the dispatcher said. He wasn't going back to that bridge. Not at night, not in a storm, not ever. But even as he made that promise to himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that the bridge wasn't done with him yet. Asa kept his promise for 3 weeks. He took the long routes, the ones that added hours to his trips, and cut into his sleep schedule. He hauled freight south through Wyoming, east through the Dakotas, anywhere that didn't require crossing Meridian Bridge. The dispatcher noticed, started asking questions. Why the mileage discrepancies? Why the extended delivery times? Asa gave vague answers about road conditions and weather delays, but he could hear the skepticism in the dispatcher's voice. By the 4th week, he didn't have a choice anymore. The company had a contract with a mining operation near Ashfall, and Asa was the only driver available who knew the route. The load was time-sensitive, high-value equipment that needed to be there by Friday morning. No exceptions, no alternate routes. The dispatcher made it clear: take the direct route through the mountains, or find another job. Asa sat in his apartment that Wednesday night, staring at the assignment sheet. The route was marked in red on the attached map, a straight line from Fargo to Ashfall, right through the mountains, right over Meridian Bridge. He thought about refusing. He had some savings, enough to last a few months while he looked for work with another company. But trucking was all he knew, and jobs were scarce. At 42, starting over wasn't as easy as it had been in his 20s. And there was another part of him, a stubborn part, that refused to let a bridge dictate his life. He'd crossed thousands of bridges over the years. This one shouldn't be any different. So he took the job. He left Fargo at dawn on Thursday, the rig loaded with drilling equipment and spare parts. The weather forecast was clear. No storms predicted for the next 48 hours. That was something, at least. If he had to cross Meridian Bridge again, he wanted daylight and dry roads. The drive was uneventful for the first 6 hours. Asa kept the radio on, listening to talk shows and news broadcasts, anything to fill the silence. He stopped once for fuel and a quick meal, then pushed on toward the mountains. The sun was high and bright, and the roads were clear. Everything looked normal. But as he climbed into the foothills, the unease returned. It started as a tightness in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name. The landscape looked the same as always, pine trees and snow-covered slopes, but something felt off. The air seemed thicker, the light dimmer, even though the sky was cloudless. Asa tried to shake it off. He was just nervous, he told himself. Nervous about crossing the bridge again. It was natural. Anyone would feel the same after what he'd experienced. But the feeling didn't go away. It grew stronger as he climbed higher, until his hands were clammy on the wheel and his heart was beating too fast. He turned off the radio, needing silence to focus, and that's when he heard it. A voice, faint and distant, like someone calling from far away. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Urgent warning. Asa glanced at the CB. It was off. He'd turned it off that morning, not wanting to hear any transmissions that might spook him. But the voice continued, growing slightly louder. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, like it was inside the cab with him. He pulled over at a turnout and killed the engine. The silence was immediate and total. No wind, no traffic, no birds, just absolute quiet. Asa sat perfectly still, listening. For a moment there was nothing. Then the voice came again, clearer this time. Don't cross at night. Asa's blood ran cold. He looked around the cab, checking the mirrors, the windows, the back of the sleeper. No one there. He was alone. But the voice had been real. He'd heard it as clearly as if someone had been sitting in the passenger seat. He grabbed his phone, hands shaking, and checked the time. 2:47 p.m. He had maybe 3 hours of daylight left, maybe 4 if he pushed it. If he kept moving at a steady pace, he could reach the bridge before sunset, cross it in daylight, like he'd planned. He started the engine and pulled back onto the road. The unease was still there, but so was his determination. He was going to cross that bridge, prove to himself once and for all that there was nothing to fear, and then he was going to finish this job and never take this route again. The road narrowed as he climbed higher, and the trees closed in on both sides. Asa kept his speed steady, his eyes on the road ahead. He passed the spot where he'd first heard the CB warning weeks ago, the place where the storm had started. Today, the sky was clear. No snow, no wind, just cold mountain air and the steady hum of the engine. He was 10 miles from the bridge when he saw the vehicle ahead. A pickup truck, old and battered, parked on the shoulder with its hood up. Asa slowed as he approached, scanning for any sign of the driver. The truck looked abandoned, no one standing nearby, no footprints in the snow around it. As he passed, he glanced in the side mirror. The truck was still there, hood up, looking like it had been sitting for hours. But something caught his eye. Movement inside the cab. A figure, sitting in the driver's seat, perfectly still. Asa hit the brakes. The rig slowed to a crawl, and he stared at the mirror. The figure hadn't moved. It just sat there, facing forward, hands on the wheel. From this distance, Asa couldn't make out any details, just a dark silhouette against the pale interior of the truck. He should keep going. Every instinct told him to keep going, but he couldn't shake the image of that figure, sitting motionless in a truck that looked broken down. What if someone needed help? What if they were injured or worse? Asa cursed under his breath and pulled over. He set the air brakes and climbed out of the cab, his boots crunching in the snow. The air was cold and still, and his breath fogged in front of his face. He walked back toward the pickup, moving slowly, keeping his eyes on the cab. As he got closer, he could see the figure more clearly. It was a man, wearing a heavy coat and a knit cap. His hands were on the wheel, and his head was tilted slightly forward, like he was asleep, or unconscious. "Hey," Asa called out. "You okay?" No response. The man didn't move, didn't turn his head. Asa stepped closer, close enough to see through the windshield. And that's when he saw the man's face. It was pale, too pale, and his eyes were open, staring straight ahead with a glassy, lifeless expression. Asa felt his stomach drop. He reached for the door handle, then hesitated. Something about this felt wrong. The truck, the man, the timing. It was too convenient, too perfectly placed. He stepped back and pulled out his phone. No signal, of course not. He was too high in the mountains, too far from any cell tower. He looked back at the pickup. The man still hadn't moved. Asa made a decision. He'd drive to the next town, call the police, and let them handle it. He wasn't equipped to deal with this, and he couldn't afford to get delayed. He turned and started walking back toward his rig. That's when he heard the door. A metallic creak, the sound of hinges that hadn't been oiled in years. Asa spun around. The pickup's driver's side door was open. The man was still sitting in the cab, but his head had turned. He was looking directly at Asa. "You shouldn't be here," the man said. His voice was flat, emotionless. Asa took a step back. "I was just trying to help. Are you okay? Do you need—" "Turn around," the man interrupted. "Go back the way you came." Asa's heart was pounding now. "What are you talking about? I'm heading to Ashfall. I've got a delivery." The man climbed out of the truck. He moved slowly, stiffly, like his joints weren't working properly. He stood there, one hand on the doorframe, and stared at Asa with those glassy eyes. "The bridge," the man said. "You can't cross it. Not today." Asa felt a chill run down his spine. "How do you know where I'm going?" The man didn't answer. He just stood there, swaying slightly in the cold wind. And then Asa noticed something that made his blood freeze. The man's coat. It was a road crew jacket, the kind with reflective stripes and a company logo on the chest. And on the left breast, stitched in faded letters, was a name. D. Kincannon. Asa took another step back, his mind racing. It wasn't possible. Doyle Kincannon had disappeared in 1987, nearly 40 years ago. This couldn't be him. It had to be someone else, a relative, maybe. wearing an old jacket. But the man's face. Asa had seen the picture in the news article. The grainy photo of Doyle Kincannon from the 80s. And this man looked the same. Not older. Not aged by 4 decades. The same. "You need to leave," the man said again. "Before it's too late." Asa didn't wait to hear more. He turned and ran back to his rig, his boots slipping on the icy pavement. He yanked open the door, climbed into the cab and slammed it shut behind him. His hands fumbled with the ignition, and the engine roared to life. He didn't look back. He just shifted into gear and pulled onto the road, the tires spinning for a moment before catching. In the mirror, he could see the pickup. The man was still standing there, watching. And as Asa accelerated away, the man raised one hand, not waving, just pointing. Pointing toward the road ahead, toward the bridge. Asa's breath came in short, ragged gasps. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep them on the wheel. But he didn't slow down. He kept driving, pushing the rig faster than he should have on the mountain road, desperate to put distance between himself and that pickup truck. He was 5 miles from the bridge when the sun began to set. The light faded quickly in the mountains, the shadows lengthening and merging until the road was bathed in twilight. Asa glanced at the clock. 5:23 p.m. He'd lost more time than he'd thought. If he didn't reach the bridge in the next 15 minutes, he'd be crossing it after dark. He pressed down on the accelerator, but the rig was already at its limit. The road was too steep, too winding. He couldn't push it any faster without risking a jackknife. The CB, still turned off, suddenly crackled to life. Asa jumped, his heart hammering. He stared at the radio. He hadn't touched it, hadn't turned it on. But the speaker was hissing with static, and beneath the noise he could hear a voice. The same voice he'd heard before, low and urgent. "Don't cross at night." Asa grabbed the handset even though he knew it was pointless. "Who is this? What do you want?" The static grew louder, and the voice fragmented into broken syllables. "Not safe. Turn. Wait for light. I can't turn around," Asa shouted into the handset. "I have a job. I have to cross that bridge." The static cut out, leaving only silence. Then a different voice came through. Clearer this time. Familiar. "Asa." He froze. No one on the CB should know his name. He hadn't identified himself, hadn't given his call sign. But the voice had said his name as clearly as if someone were sitting next to him. "Asa, listen to me. You need to stop. You need to wait." "Who is this?" Asa demanded, his voice shaking. "Someone who tried to cross at night, someone who didn't make it." Asa felt the cab grow colder. His breath fogged in the air, even though the heater was running full blast. He looked at the temperature gauge. Normal. But the cold was seeping in, creeping through the vents and the seams in the doors. "What happened to you?" Asa asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The voice on the CB was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I stayed too long. I thought I could finish the job, but the bridge, it doesn't let you leave. Not once the sun goes down." Asa's eyes darted to the road ahead. He could see the bridge now, a dark outline against the fading light. The iron framework looked skeletal in the twilight, and the gorge below was already lost in shadow. "What do I do?" Asa asked. "Stop. Wait until morning. Don't cross at night." Asa's foot hovered over the brake. Every rational part of his mind told him to stop, to pull over and wait. But the stubborn part, the part that had kept him driving for 17 years, pushed back. He was so close. The bridge was right there. If he just kept going, he could cross it in 5 minutes and be done with this. "I can make it," Asa said, more to himself than to the voice on the CB. "I'll be fine." "No." the voice said, sharp and commanding. "You won't." I thought the same thing. I was wrong. Asa's foot moved to the brake. The rig began to slow. He was a quarter-mile from the bridge now, close enough to see the approach, the cones that marked the entrance. Close enough to see something else, too. Lights. Work lights. Just like the ones he'd seen weeks ago. They were set up on the bridge deck, casting harsh yellow pools across the iron framework. And standing near them, barely visible in the fading light, were figures. 3 of them wearing road crew jackets moving slowly across the deck. Asa's breath caught in his throat. The road crew. They were here, working on the bridge. That meant it was safe. That meant he could cross. But something about the scene felt wrong. The figures moved too slowly, too mechanically, and their shadows, cast by the work lights, didn't quite match their movements. They stretched too long, reaching across the deck like grasping hands. "Do you see them?" the voice on the CB asked. Asa nodded, even though no one could see him. "The road crew. They're on the bridge." "No," the voice said. "They're not." "What do you mean?" "I can see them right there." "Look closer." Asa squinted through the windshield. The figures were still moving, but now that he was paying attention, he realized they weren't doing anything. They weren't carrying tools, weren't working on the deck. They were just walking, back and forth, over and over, like they were pacing or waiting. "They're not real," the voice said. "They're what's left, the ones who didn't leave." Asa slammed on the brakes. The rig shuddered to a stop, the trailer swaying slightly behind him. He was 50 feet from the bridge now, close enough to see the details. The rusted iron, the icy deck, the figures moving in the work lights, and then one of them stopped. It turned toward Asa's rig, and even from this distance, even in the dim light, Asa could see its face, pale and lifeless, just like the man in the pickup truck, just like Doyle Kincannon. The figure raised one hand, beckoning. "Come closer. Step onto the bridge." Asa's hands moved on their own. He threw the rig into reverse and the tires spun on the icy pavement. The rig lurched backward, the trailer fishtailing slightly. He corrected, straightened it out, and kept backing up until he was 100 feet from the bridge. Then he stopped, set the air brakes, and sat in the cab, shaking. The CB crackled. "Good. Now stay there. Wait until morning." Asa looked at the clock. 5:41 p.m. Sunset was in less than 20 minutes. He'd have to wait all night. 13 hours sitting in the cab, alone on this mountain road, with that bridge and those figures just 100 feet away. "I can't," Asa said. "I can't stay here all night." "You have to. It's the only way." Asa closed his eyes, trying to calm his racing heart. He thought about turning around, driving back the way he'd come. But it was a 2-hour drive to the nearest town, and the road would be pitch black within the hour. He'd be driving blind on icy mountain roads, with no guarantee he wouldn't end up in a ditch. He opened his eyes and looked at the bridge again. The figures were still there, still pacing, still waiting. "Okay," Asa said quietly. "I'll wait." The CB hissed with static, then went silent. Asa turned off the engine to save fuel, then pulled a blanket from the sleeper and wrapped it around himself. The temperature in the cab began to drop immediately, and he could see his breath fogging in the air. He settled in for a long night, his eyes fixed on the bridge, watching the figures move back and forth in the work lights. And as the last light faded from the sky and darkness swallowed the mountains, Asa realized he wasn't just waiting for morning. He was waiting to see if the bridge would let him leave at all. The first hour was the hardest. Asa sat in the darkened cab, wrapped in his blanket, watching the bridge through the windshield. The work lights cast their harsh yellow glow across the deck, and the figures continued their endless pacing, back and forth, never stopping, never acknowledging each other, just walking the same paths over and over, like machines stuck in a loop. Asa counted them. 3 figures, all wearing road crew jackets, all moving with that same mechanical precision. He tried to make out their faces, but the distance and the shadows made it impossible. They were just silhouettes, dark shapes against the illuminated deck. The temperature in the cab continued to drop. Asa could see his breath now, thick clouds of fog that hung in the air before dissipating. He'd turned off the engine to conserve fuel, and without the heater running, the cold seeped in through every crack and seam. He pulled the blanket tighter and tucked his hands under his arms, trying to preserve warmth. The CB remained silent. No static, no voices, just dead air. Asa had left it on, hoping the voice that had warned him would come back, give him some guidance, tell him what to expect. But there was nothing. He was alone with the darkness and the bridge and the figures that wouldn't stop moving. At some point during the second hour, Asa noticed something new. The figures weren't just pacing anymore. They were gathering. All 3 of them had stopped at the center of the bridge, standing in a loose cluster near the spot where the tire tracks had ended weeks ago. They stood perfectly still, facing Asa's rig, watching him. Asa felt his heart rate spike. He told himself it was a trick of the light, that they weren't actually looking at him. They were too far away to see into the cab, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they knew exactly where he was, that they were waiting for him to make a move. He checked his phone. Still no signal. The battery was at 60%. He turned it off to save power and set it on the dashboard. Then he reached into the sleeper and pulled out a flashlight, testing it. The beam was strong and steady. It made him feel slightly better, having something he could control, something that could push back the darkness if he needed it. The third hour brought a new sound. It started as a faint creaking, like metal under stress, and at first, Asa thought it was just the bridge settling. Old structures made noise, especially in the cold, but the sound grew louder, more rhythmic. It was coming from the bridge, but it wasn't the random groaning of stressed iron. It was deliberate, measured. Footsteps. Asa sat up straighter, his eyes locked on the bridge. The 3 figures were still standing at the center, motionless. But the sound of footsteps continued, growing closer. Someone was walking on the bridge deck, moving from the far end toward Asa's position. He grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward the bridge, but the beam didn't reach far enough. The work lights were too bright, creating a wall of glare that his flashlight couldn't penetrate. He could hear the footsteps clearly now, heavy boots on metal, the sound echoing through the gorge below. And then he saw it. A 4th figure, emerging from the darkness beyond the work lights. It walked slowly, steadily, moving with more purpose than the other 3. As it entered the pool of light, Asa could see it was wearing the same road crew jacket. But unlike the others, this one was looking down, watching its own feet as it walked. The figure stopped at the edge of the lit area, about 50 feet from Asa's rig. It stood there for a long moment, swaying slightly. Then it raised its head and looked directly at the cab. Asa's breath caught. Even from this distance, even in the harsh light, he could see the face clearly now. It was Doyle Kincannon, the same man he'd seen in the pickup truck, the same pale skin, the same glassy eyes. But now there was something else in that expression. Recognition and sadness. The figure raised one hand, palm out. Not beckoning this time, just showing. And that's when Asa saw it. The hand was wrong. The fingers were bent at unnatural angles and the skin had a waxy, frozen quality, like it had been exposed to extreme cold for too long. Asa felt bile rise in his throat. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The figure lowered its hand and took another step forward, then another. moving toward the rig with slow, deliberate steps. Asa's hand shot out to the ignition. He had to leave. Had to start the engine and get out of here. Warnings be damned. But as his fingers touched the key, the CB crackled to life. "Don't run." It was the same voice from before, calm but urgent. "If you run, you won't make it. The road behind you, it's not there anymore." Asa spun around, looking through the rear window of the sleeper. The road behind the rig was dark, swallowed by the night. He grabbed the flashlight and pointed it backward, and his blood ran cold. The road was gone. Where asphalt should have been, there was nothing but darkness. Not shadow, not night. Just void. Like someone had erased everything beyond a certain point, leaving only the small circle of ground where his rig sat. "What the hell is this?" Asa whispered. "The bridge," the CB voice said. "It changes things, warps them. Once the sun goes down, the rules are different." Asa turned back to the windshield. The figure was closer now, maybe 30 feet away. It had stopped walking and was just standing there, watching. The other 3 figures at the center of the bridge hadn't moved. "What do they want?" Asa asked. "To warn you. To show you what happens if you cross." "But I didn't cross. I stopped. I'm waiting, just like you said. And that's why you still have a chance. But you need to understand something, Asa. This bridge, it's hungry. It's been hungry since it was built. They used prison labor to construct it in the 30s. 3 men died during construction, fell into the gorge, and their bodies were never recovered. The bridge was finished on schedule, dedicated on time, and everyone forgot about them." Asa stared at the figure in the road crew jacket. Doyle Kincannon fell too, in 1987. He didn't fall. He stayed too long. Tried to finish his shift after dark. The bridge took him, same as it took the others. And now they're all part of it. Trapped in that night, walking the same paths, trying to warn people like you. "How do you know all this?" Asa asked, his voice shaking. The CB was silent for a moment, then, "Because I'm one of them." Asa felt the temperature drop even further. Frost was forming on the inside of the windshield now, creeping across the glass in delicate patterns. He wiped it away with his sleeve, but it came back immediately. "My name was Ren Dalrymple," the voice continued. "I was a truck driver, just like you. Came through here on a February night in 2003. I thought I could make it across before the storm hit. I was wrong." Asa's throat tightened. "What happened?" "I made it halfway across. Then the engine stalled. I couldn't restart it. I sat there for 3 hours, waiting for help. But no help came. The cold got worse. I tried to climb out, tried to walk, but my legs wouldn't work. By the time the sun came up, I was gone." "But your voice," Asa said. "You're talking to me now. This is what's left. A warning, a loop. I've been trying to help people for 20 years. Some listen. Most don't." Asa looked at the figure in the road. Doyle Kincannon was still standing there, motionless. Is he trying to help too? In his own way, they all are. But they can't speak, can't use the radio. All they can do is show you what happened to them. Hope you're smart enough to understand. The figure in the road took another step forward. It was close enough now that Asa could see the details of the jacket. The name stitched on the chest, the ice crystals forming on the fabric. And he could see something else. The figure's eyes weren't glassy because of death. They were frozen. Literally frozen, ice coating the surface like a thin film. "What do I do?" Asa asked quietly. "Wait. When the sun rises, the bridge will release its hold. The road behind you will come back. The figures will fade. You'll be able to cross safely, but you can't leave the rig, you can't step onto the ground, and you absolutely cannot step onto the bridge." "Why?" Because the moment your feet touch that deck, you become part of it. The bridge will claim you, same as it claimed us, and you'll spend eternity trying to warn the next person. Asa felt tears sting his eyes. He wiped them away angrily. How long until sunrise? 7 hours, maybe 8. 7 hours. Asa looked at the fuel gauge. He'd burned through a quarter tank just getting here. He had enough to idle the engine for maybe 2 hours, keep the heater running, keep the cold at bay. After that, he'd be running on empty. He'd have to sit in the freezing cab with no heat, no light, just the blanket and his own body heat. I don't know if I can make it that long, Asa said. You can. You're stronger than you think. And you have something we didn't have. What's that? A warning. You know what's waiting for you. You can prepare. We went in blind. Asa took a shaky breath and nodded, even though no one could see him. He reached for the ignition and started the engine. The heater roared to life, blowing warm air into the cab. He'd run it for an hour, get the temperature up, then shut it down to conserve fuel. Repeat as needed. He could do this. The figure in the road took one more step forward, then stopped. It was close enough now that Asa could have opened the door and touched it. But he didn't. He just sat there, watching, as the figure slowly raised its hand again. This time, it wasn't showing Asa its frozen fingers. It was pointing, not at the bridge, not at the rig, but at Asa himself. The meaning was clear. This could be you. This will be you, if you're not careful. Asa nodded slowly, acknowledging the warning. The figure lowered its hand and began to walk backward, retracing its steps toward the bridge. It moved slowly, never turning around, just backing away until it merged with the shadows at the edge of the work lights. The CB crackled. Good. Now settle in. It's going to be a long night. Wren Dalrymple's voice faded, replaced by static. Asa turned the volume down and leaned back in his seat, the blanket wrapped around him. The heater was working, pushing back the cold, but he could still see his breath. The frost on the windshield had stopped spreading, but it hadn't receded. He spent the next hour trying to stay warm and awake. He did exercises in the cab, flexing his muscles, moving his arms and legs to keep the blood flowing. He ate a granola bar from his stash in the sleeper, washing it down with cold water. He checked his phone every 15 minutes hoping for a signal, but there was nothing. At the end of the hour, he shut down the engine. The silence was immediate and oppressive. The heater fan wound down, and the warmth began to dissipate. Asa pulled the blanket tighter and tucked his chin into his chest, trying to preserve heat. The cold came back fast. Within 30 minutes, the cab felt like a freezer. Asa's fingers and toes were numb, and his face ached from the frigid air. He knew he couldn't last 7 more hours like this. He'd have to start the engine again soon. But before he could reach for the ignition, he heard something new. A tapping sound. Soft and rhythmic. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. The same pattern he'd heard weeks ago, coming from the trailer. Asa froze. The tapping was coming from outside the cab, from the passenger door. He turned his head slowly, afraid of what he might see. There was a face pressed against the window. Pale and frozen, eyes glassy, mouth open in a silent scream. It was one of the figures from the bridge. It had left the deck and crossed the distance to the rig without making a sound. Asa's heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to scream, wanted to start the engine and drive, but Wren's words echoed in his mind. Don't run. If you run, you won't make it. The face at the window stared at him for a long moment. Then the tapping came again. 3 times. Pause. 3 times. The figure was trying to communicate, trying to tell him something. Asa forced himself to breathe slowly, to think. 3 taps. What could it mean? He looked at the clock. 11:47 p.m. 3 hours since he'd stopped. That left roughly 5 hours until dawn. The figure tapped again, 3 times. Then it raised its frozen hand and held up 3 fingers. 3 of them. 3 men who died during construction. 3 figures on the bridge. And then Asa understood. The figure wasn't threatening him, it was showing him. 3 died building the bridge. Doyle made 4. Wren made 5. If Asa stepped onto that bridge, he'd make 6. Asa nodded at the figure, acknowledging the message. The face at the window stared at him for a moment longer, then slowly withdrew. Asa heard footsteps crunching in the snow, moving away from the rig. He looked through the windshield and saw the figure walking back towards the bridge, its movement slow and deliberate. The CB crackled softly. "They're trying to help. They don't want you to join them." "I know," Asa whispered. "I understand." "Good. Now stay strong. Dawn is coming." Asa restarted the engine and ran the heater for another hour. Then he shut it down again and endured the cold. He repeated this pattern 3 more times, cycling between warmth and freezing, between alertness and the edge of hypothermic drowsiness. His fuel gauge dropped steadily, the needle creeping toward empty. By 4:30 a.m., he was running on fumes. The last time he'd started the engine, it had coughed and sputtered before catching. He knew he wouldn't be able to start it again. From here on out, he was on his own. Just the blanket, the cold, and the darkness. He sat in the freezing cab, shivering violently, watching the bridge through the frosted windshield. The work lights were still on, the figures still pacing. But something was different now. The light in the east had changed. It was no longer pure black. There was a faint gray tinge to the horizon, barely perceptible but definitely there. Dawn was coming. Asa held on, his teeth chattering, his body racked with shivers. He kept his eyes on that horizon, watching the gray slowly lighten to pale blue. The stars began to fade. The work lights on the bridge seemed to dim. At 5:52 a.m., the sun broke over the mountains. The first rays of light spilled across the valley, touching the tops of the trees, painting the snow with gold. Asa felt warmth on his face, real warmth, and he wanted to cry with relief. He looked at the bridge. The work lights were off now. The figures were gone. The deck was empty, just rusted iron and ice, exactly as it had been when he'd crossed it in daylight weeks ago. And when he looked in the rear mirror, the road was back, solid asphalt stretching behind him into the distance. The CB crackled one last time. "You made it, now go. Cross while you can, and don't look back." Asa didn't need to be told twice. He turned the key, praying the engine would start. It coughed, sputtered, then roared to life on the last drops of fuel in the tank. Asa shifted into gear and drove forward onto the bridge. The crossing took less than a minute. The deck was solid, the ice minimal. The iron framework looked old, but stable. There were no figures, no voices, no warnings. Just an ordinary bridge on an ordinary morning. When Asa reached the far side and felt the tires hit solid ground, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He drove for another 2 miles until he found a gas station at the edge of a small town. He pulled in, filled the tank, and sat in the cab for a long time, just breathing. He never told anyone what happened that night. Who would believe him? A haunted bridge, frozen figures, warnings from the dead. It sounded insane even to him, and he'd lived through it. But he kept the picture on his phone, the one he'd taken of the railing, with Doyle Kincannon's name scratched into the metal. And sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, he'd pull it up and stare at it, remembering. He never crossed Meridian Bridge again. He took the long route, every single time, no matter what the dispatcher said. And when other drivers asked him about it, asked why he avoided that particular stretch of highway, he'd just shake his head and change the subject. Some bridges, he learned, aren't meant to be crossed after dark. Some bridges demand a price for passage. And some bridges never forget the people they've claimed. Asa Merriweather was lucky. He'd been warned. He'd listened, and he'd survived. But every time he drove past that exit, the one that led up into the mountains toward Meridian Bridge, he'd slow down and look. And sometimes, just sometimes, he thought he could see lights in the distance. Yellow work lights, flickering through the trees. And he'd press down on the accelerator and keep driving, leaving the bridge and its frozen guardians behind in the darkness where they belonged. The weather report had called for light flurries, maybe an inch of accumulation by morning. Nothing Orrin Kepler hadn't driven through 100 times before. He'd been hauling freight across the upper Midwest for 12 years, and he knew the lake effect systems that rolled off Superior like he knew the gears in his transmission. They were unpredictable, sure, but manageable if you kept your head and didn't push your luck. He'd left Duluth at 4 in the afternoon with a load of machine parts destined for a manufacturing plant in Sault Ste. Marie. The route took him along the south shore of Lake Superior, a stretch of highway that hugged the coastline and offered spectacular views when the weather was clear. Today, the lake was invisible, hidden behind a wall of gray clouds that pressed down from the north. The air had that heavy, wet quality that promised snow, and Orrin could smell it through the cab's ventilation system, cold and metallic. By 6 o'clock, the flurries had started. Thin and sparse at first, just enough to dust the windshield between wiper passes. Orrin kept his speed steady at 55, the rig moving smoothly along the 2-lane highway. Traffic was light, just a few cars heading in the opposite direction, their headlights cutting brief holes in the gathering dusk. The radio played classic rock at low volume, and Orrin hummed along absently, his mind already planning the route for tomorrow's return trip. The snow began to thicken around 7. The flurries turned to steady fall, and visibility dropped from a quarter mile to maybe 500 feet. Orrin slowed to 45, then 40, his eyes scanning the road ahead for brake lights or reflectors. The highway had narrowed, the shoulders disappearing under accumulating snow, and the center line was already buried. He was navigating by feel now, by the slight rise of the road surface and the dark shapes of trees on either side. He'd driven this route enough times to know the landmarks. The gas station at mile marker 47, the scenic overlook at 62, and at mile 79, the Portage Bridge, a massive lift span that crossed the mouth of a narrow bay connecting 2 sections of the lake. The bridge was old, built in the 50s, and it still operated on a manual system. A bridge tender sat in a small control house at the center span, raising and lowering the deck to allow boat traffic to pass underneath. Orrin had crossed it dozens of times, usually without incident. But tonight, as he approached the bridge, something felt different. The snow was coming down heavier now, thick, wet flakes that stuck to everything and turned the world into a blur of white and gray. The wind had picked up too, gusting hard enough to rock the trailer and send snow swirling across the road in ghostly spirals. He slowed to 30 as he crested the hill that led down to the bridge approach. Through the snow, he could make out the dark shape of the span, a long, flat structure rising slightly as it crossed the water. The control house sat at the midpoint, a small square building with yellow windows that glowed faintly in the storm. Red signal lights marked the corners of the bridge, but they looked dim, almost obscured by the falling snow. As Orrin descended toward the approach, he noticed something odd. The barrier gates were down. The red and white striped arms stretched across both lanes, blocking access to the bridge. Warning lights flashed in sequence, the same pattern used when the bridge was raised for boat traffic. Orrin frowned. It was late November, well past the shipping season. The lake should be empty, no boats moving, no reason to raise the bridge. He slowed to a crawl and pulled up to the barrier, setting his air brakes. Through the windshield, he could see the bridge deck beyond the gates. It looked normal, level, and solid, not raised. So why were the barriers down? He grabbed the CB handset and keyed it. "This is eastbound commercial at Portage Bridge. Anyone know why the barriers are activated? Bridge looks closed, but the deck is down." Static hissed through the speaker. He tried again. "Portage Bridge Control. This is eastbound commercial requesting status. Do you copy?" More static. Then a voice, faint and crackling, barely audible over the interference. "Wait for clearance. Deck needs." The transmission cut out. Oren adjusted the squelch, trying to clean up the signal, but the voice didn't return. He set the handset down and stared at the barrier. He could see the control house clearly now, maybe 200 feet away. The windows were lit, and he thought he could see movement inside, a shadow passing across the glass. He considered his options. He could wait here, hope the bridge tender came out to explain the situation. Or he could try calling on his cell phone, see if he could get through to someone. He pulled out his phone and checked the screen. 1 bar of signal, flickering between 1 and 0. He dialed the number for the State Highway Department's road condition hotline, but the call dropped before it connected. Oren cursed under his breath and set the phone aside. He was about to try the CB again when he saw headlights in his mirror. A vehicle was approaching from behind, moving slowly through the snow. As it got closer, Oren could see it was a county sheriff's cruiser, its light bar dark, but its headlights cutting through the storm. The cruiser pulled up alongside Oren's cab and stopped. The driver's window rolled down, and Oren rolled down his own window, letting in a blast of cold air and snow. The deputy was young, maybe late 20s, with a serious face and sharp eyes. He leaned toward his window and raised his voice over the wind. "You been here long?" "Just pulled up," Oren shouted back. "Barriers are down, but the deck looks level. Can't raise anyone on the radio." The deputy nodded. "Yeah, we've been getting reports. System's been acting up all day. Bridge tender called it in this morning, said the controls were cycling on their own. State sent a tech out, but he couldn't find anything wrong. So, is it safe to cross?" The deputy hesitated. "Deck's solid. No reason it shouldn't be. But the tender's supposed to reset the barriers manually before letting anyone through. Procedure, you know." "You want to go check?" Oren asked. The deputy looked at the control house, then back at Oren. "Yeah, stay put. I'll see what's going on." He rolled up his window and drove forward, maneuvering the cruiser around the barrier. Oren watched as the deputy parked near the control house and climbed out, his uniform already dusted with snow. The deputy walked to the door of the control house and knocked. No response. He knocked again, harder this time, then tried the handle. The door opened, and the deputy stepped inside. Oren waited, engine idling, heater running. The snow continued to fall, accumulating on the hood and windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. He checked the dashboard clock. 7:34 p.m. He'd planned to be in Sault Ste. Marie by 9, grab a late dinner, and catch a few hours of sleep before the morning delivery. But if this bridge was going to be closed for much longer, he'd have to find an alternate route, which would add at least 2 hours to the trip. 5 minutes passed. The deputy hadn't come out of the control house. Oren could see the lit windows, but no movement inside. He picked up the CB handset again. "Deputy, you copy? Everything okay in there?" No response. Oren frowned. He set the handset down and stared at the control house. Something about this felt wrong. The deputy should have been back by now, or at least radioed to let him know what was happening. Another minute passed. Then 2. Oren made a decision. He killed the engine, grabbed his flashlight from the side pocket, and climbed out of the cab. The cold hit him immediately, a sharp wind that cut through his jacket and stung his face. Snow swirled around him, and he had to squint to see more than a few feet ahead. He walked to the barrier, ducked under it, and headed toward the control house. His boots crunched in the fresh snow, and the wind howled across the open water of the bay, carrying with it the smell of ice and wet concrete. As he got closer to the control house, he noticed something odd. The windows were still lit, but the light was wrong. It flickered slightly, like candles instead of electric bulbs. Orrin reached the door and knocked. "Deputy, you in there?" Silence. He tried the handle. The door swung open easily, and Orrin stepped inside. The control house was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with a single desk, a chair, and a bank of controls along one wall. The controls were old-fashioned, mechanical switches and levers with faded labels. A space heater sat in one corner, unplugged, and in the center of the room, standing perfectly still, was the deputy. He was facing the controls, his back to Orrin, one hand resting on a lever. He didn't turn around when Orrin entered. Didn't move at all. "Deputy?" Orrin said cautiously. "You okay?" No response. Orrin stepped closer, his flashlight beam sweeping across the room. The light source he'd seen from outside wasn't candles. It was the control panel itself. Several indicator lights were glowing, pulsing in a slow rhythm that didn't match any pattern Orrin recognized. "Hey," Orrin said, louder this time. He reached out and touched the deputy's shoulder. The deputy turned slowly, mechanically, and Orrin took an involuntary step back. The deputy's face was pale, his eyes unfocused and glassy. His lips were moving, forming words, but no sound came out. Orrin felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" The deputy's lips kept moving. Orrin leaned closer, trying to make out what he was saying, and then he heard it. Not from the deputy's mouth, but from somewhere else. A whisper, faint and distant, like it was coming through the walls. November 14, 1958. Orrin spun around, looking for the source of the voice. The room was empty except for him and the deputy. But the whisper continued, overlapping now, multiple voices speaking the same words. November 14, 1958. Shift change, midnight. Orrin backed toward the door, his heart pounding. The deputy still hadn't moved, still stood there with his hand on the lever, lips moving silently. The control panel lights pulsed faster now, and the whispers grew louder. "Wait for clearance. Deck needs inspection. Wait for clearance." Orrin grabbed the deputy's arm and pulled. "We need to go. Now." The deputy didn't resist, but he didn't help either. He moved like a sleepwalker, his eyes still unfocused, his expression blank. Orrin half dragged him out of the control house and into the snow. The moment they crossed the threshold, the deputy gasped and stumbled, his eyes snapping into focus. "What?" The deputy looked around, confused. "What happened? I was just—" "We're leaving," Orrin said firmly. He guided the deputy back toward the cruiser, glancing over his shoulder at the control house. The windows were still lit, and through the glass, Orrin could see shadows moving inside. More than one. Shifting and pacing like people waiting for something. The deputy climbed into his cruiser, still looking dazed. Orrin leaned down to the window. "You need to call this in. Something's not right with that building." The deputy nodded slowly, reaching for his radio. Orrin didn't wait to see if he got through. He walked back to his rig, climbed into the cab, and locked the doors. His hands were shaking, and his breath came in short, sharp gasps. He sat there for a long moment, trying to process what he'd just seen. The deputy standing motionless. The whispers. The shadows in the control house. None of it made sense. The CB crackled to life, startling him. "All units, be advised. Portage Bridge is experiencing technical difficulties. Recommend alternate routes until further notice." The transmission was clear, professional, nothing like the garbled voice he'd heard earlier. Orrin grabbed the handset. "This is eastbound commercial at Portage. What's the nature of the technical difficulties?" A pause, then, "Control system malfunction. Bridge tender is unavailable. State maintenance has been notified. ETA unknown due to weather conditions." "Copy that," Orrin said. "Any word on how long the closure might last?" "Negative. Recommend you find lodging and wait for morning update." Orrin set the handset down and looked at the bridge. The barriers were still down, the warning lights still flashing. The deputy's cruiser was still parked near the control house, but the deputy himself was nowhere to be seen. Orrin checked his mirrors, looking for any sign of movement, but the storm had thickened, reducing visibility to almost nothing. He made a decision. He'd back up, turn around, and find a hotel in the nearest town. Come back in the morning when the weather cleared and the bridge was operational. This whole situation felt wrong, and Orrin had learned over the years to trust his instincts. He started the engine and was about to release the air brakes when he saw something that made him freeze. Standing at the edge of the bridge, just beyond the barrier, was a figure. It was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned work coat and cap. The figure stood perfectly still, facing Orrin's rig, and even through the snow, Orrin could see it was watching him. Orrin's hand moved to the CB, but before he could key it, the figure raised one arm. Not waving, just pointing at the control house. Orrin stared at the figure, his pulse racing. He wanted to look away, wanted to shift into reverse and get out of here, but he couldn't move. The figure lowered its arm and took a step forward, then another, moving toward the rig with slow, deliberate steps. Orrin's paralysis broke. He slammed the rig into reverse and hit the accelerator. The tires spun on the snow-covered pavement, then caught. The rig lurched backward, and Orrin corrected the wheel, straightening it out. He kept reversing until he was 100 feet from the barrier, then shifted into first and turned the rig around. In the mirror, he could see the figure. It had stopped at the barrier and was standing there, still as a statue, watching him leave. Orrin didn't slow down. He drove back the way he'd come, pushing the rig faster than he should have on the icy road, desperate to put distance between himself and that bridge. He didn't stop until he reached a truck stop 20 miles west, a brightly lit oasis in the storm. He pulled into a parking spot near the building and killed the engine. His hands were still shaking. He sat in the cab for a long time, staring at nothing, trying to make sense of what had happened. November 14, 1958. The whispers had been specific. A date. Orrin pulled out his phone and searched for information on Portage Bridge and that date. The signal was weak, but after a few minutes, a result loaded. It was a newspaper article from November 1958. The headline read, "Bridge Tender Missing After Midnight Shift." Orrin read the article with growing unease. A woman named Mavis O'Rourke had been working the midnight shift at Portage Bridge on November 14th when she disappeared. Her coat and thermos were found in the control house, but she was never seen again. The article mentioned that the bridge had experienced mechanical problems that night, with the barriers activating on their own and the deck raising and lowering without input. A search of the bay had turned up nothing. Orrin set the phone down and stared at the darkened windshield. Mavis O'Rourke, November 14, 1958. The whispers had been her shift notes, her routine, looping endlessly in that control house. And the figure on the bridge. Was that her too? Or someone else? Someone who'd been waiting in that control house for 66 years? Orrin didn't have answers. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't going back to that bridge. Not tonight, not ever. He climbed out of the cab and walked into the truck stop, needing warmth, light, and the presence of other people. He ordered coffee and sat at a booth near the window, watching the snow fall and thinking about the deputy's blank expression and the shadows moving in the control house. Outside, the storm continued to rage, and somewhere in the darkness, Portage Bridge waited. Barriers down, lights flashing, a ghost keeping vigil over an empty span, calling out shift notes to anyone who would listen. Orrin didn't sleep that night. He tried, renting a room at the motel attached to the truck stop, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the deputy's blank face and the figure standing on the bridge. At 3 a.m., he gave up and went back down to the truck stop restaurant, ordering breakfast and more coffee while the night shift waitress eyed him with tired sympathy. By dawn, the storm had passed. The sky was clear and pale blue, and the world outside was buried under 14 inches of fresh snow. Plows were already out, their orange lights flashing as they worked to clear the highways. Orrin sat at his booth and watched the sun rise, painting the snow gold and pink, and tried to decide what to do. The logical choice was to call the dispatcher, explain that the bridge was closed, and request reassignment to a different route. The company would understand. Weather delays happened. But something nagged at him, a stubborn curiosity he couldn't quite shake. What had happened in that control house? And who was the figure on the bridge? At 7 o'clock, his phone rang. It was the dispatcher. "Kepler, what's your status? You were supposed to check in last night." "Bridge was closed," Orrin said. "Portage Bridge, mechanical issues. I'm at a truck stop about 20 miles west." "Yeah, we got the alert. Bridge reopened at 0600 this morning. State crew cleared it. You're good to proceed." Orrin felt his stomach tighten. "It's open. You sure?" "That's what the traffic report says. Why? You have a problem with it?" Orrin hesitated. How could he explain what he'd seen without sounding crazy? No problem. I'll head out now." "Good. Client's expecting delivery by noon. Don't be late." The dispatcher hung up. Orrin set the phone down and stared at his cold coffee. The bridge was open, cleared by a state crew, which meant someone had been in that control house this morning, reset the barriers, and checked the systems. Someone who presumably hadn't encountered any whispers or shadows or figures in vintage work clothes. Maybe he'd imagined it. Maybe the stress and the storm and the isolation had combined to create something that wasn't there. The deputy had seemed normal by the time Orrin left, hadn't he? Maybe the whole thing had been a shared hallucination, carbon monoxide or some other environmental factor. Orrin paid his bill and walked out to the rig. The parking lot was half empty now, most of the overnight trucks already back on the road. He climbed into the cab, started the engine, and sat for a moment, hands on the wheel. He could take an alternate route, add 2 hours to the trip but avoid the bridge entirely. Or he could push forward, cross in broad daylight with clear weather, and prove to himself that there was nothing to fear. He chose the latter. He pulled out of the truck stop and headed east, following the plowed highway back toward Portage Bridge. The roads were clear, the sky was bright, and the lake stretched out to his right like a vast sheet of wrinkled ice. Everything looked normal, safe. It took him 30 minutes to reach the bridge approach. As he crested the hill and the bridge came into view, Orrin felt his pulse quicken. The barriers were up, the warning lights were off. The bridge looked exactly as it should, a functional piece of infrastructure connecting one stretch of highway to another. He slowed as he approached, scanning the control house. The windows were dark now, no lights visible. The door was closed. There were tire tracks in the snow near the building, evidence of the state crew's visit. Everything looked normal. Orrin eased the rig onto the bridge. The deck was solid, recently plowed, with just a thin layer of snow remaining. He could feel the slight vibration of the structure beneath him as the weight of the rig pressed down on the old framework. The bay stretched out on either side, gray water visible through gaps in the ice that had formed along the edges. He was halfway across when he noticed something odd. Scratched into the snow on the deck, just ahead of his lane, were marks. Not tire tracks. Letters. Someone had written something in the snow, the lines thin and precise, like they'd been drawn with a stick or a finger. Orrin slowed almost to a stop, trying to make out the words. The marks were faint, already starting to fill in with drifting snow, but he could read them clearly enough. Shift change midnight. Orrin's blood ran cold. He glanced at the control house as he passed. The windows were still dark, but as he looked, he thought he saw movement. A shadow passing across the glass. Just for a moment. Then it was gone. He pressed down on the accelerator, urging the rig forward. The bridge wasn't long, maybe a quarter mile, but it felt like it stretched for miles. The control house slid past on his right, and Orrin kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look at the windows. He was almost to the far end when he heard it. A voice on the CB, faint and crackling with static. Waiting for relief. Shift ends at 0800. Orrin grabbed the handset. Who is this? The voice continued, ignoring his question. Deck inspection incomplete. Barrier malfunction logged. Who is this? Orrin repeated, louder this time. The voice cut out, replaced by silence. Orrin stared at the CB, his hands shaking. He recognized the cadence now, the flat, procedural tone. It was a shift report, the kind of thing a bridge tender would log in a daily record. He reached the far end of the bridge and felt the tires hit solid ground. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. He'd made it across. In daylight, in clear weather. And aside from the words in the snow and the voice on the CB, nothing had happened. He pulled over at the first turnout, a small rest area about a mile past the bridge. He needed to collect himself, needed to process what he'd just experienced. He set the air brakes and climbed out of the cab, pacing in the snow, his breath fogging in the cold air. This was real, not a hallucination, not carbon monoxide. Something was happening on that bridge. Something connected to Mavis O'Rourke and her disappearance in 1958. But what? And why was it manifesting now, 66 years later? Orrin pulled out his phone and searched for more information. He found another article, this one from December 1958. It described how the search for Mavis O'Rourke had been called off after 2 weeks with no leads. The article mentioned that she'd been a reliable employee, never missed a shift, and had no reason to disappear. Her family had been interviewed, but they had no answers. There was a quote from the bridge superintendent at the time. Mavis was scheduled to work until 8 a.m. on the morning of November 15th. Her relief never showed up due to the storm. She was last heard on the radio at 7:45, reporting normal conditions. By the time the day shift supervisor arrived at 9, the control house was empty. Orrin read the quote again. Her relief never showed up. She'd been waiting for someone who never came, stuck in that control house during a storm, alone. And then she'd vanished. He looked back toward the bridge. From this distance, it was just a dark line against the pale sky. But he could still see the control house, a small square shape at the center of the span, and even from here, even in full daylight, it looked wrong, like a wound in the landscape that had never healed. His phone rang, startling him. The dispatcher again. "Kepler, you crossed that bridge yet?" "Yeah, just cleared it." "Good, keep moving. Weather's supposed to turn again this afternoon. I want you in Sault Ste. Marie before it hits." "Copy that," Orrin said. He was about to hang up when a thought occurred to him. Hey, you know anything about the history of Portage Bridge? The dispatcher paused. What kind of history? Anything unusual? Accidents, incidents, that sort of thing? Why? You see something out there? Orrin hesitated. No, just curious. Well, I don't keep a bridge history database, Kepler, but I know it's old. 50s, I think. They've been talking about replacing it for years, but the state keeps pushing it back. Budgets, you know. Why? No reason. Just making conversation. Save it for your delivery. Call me when you're unloaded. The dispatcher hung up. Orrin stood in the cold, staring at his phone. The bridge was old, scheduled for replacement, which meant it wouldn't be there much longer. Maybe that was why things were stirring. Maybe Mavis O'Rourke's presence, or whatever was left of it, knew the bridge's days were numbered. Orrin climbed back into the cab and pulled onto the highway. He drove east, following the coast of Lake Superior, and tried to focus on the road, but his mind kept drifting back to the control house, to the whispers, to the figure standing on the bridge. He reached Sault Ste. Marie by 11 and made his delivery without incident. The warehouse crew unloaded the machine parts, and Orrin signed the paperwork, chatting briefly with the foreman about the storm and the road conditions. Normal trucker talk. Grounding. But as he climbed back into the cab and prepared to head out, his phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. He opened it. The message was simple. Don't cross at night. Orrin stared at the screen. He didn't recognize the number, and the area code was local to the region but not specific enough to trace. He typed a reply. Who is this? The response came immediately. Someone who knows. Orrin's hands tightened on the phone. Knows what? What happened to Mavis? What happens to anyone who stays too long? Orrin felt a chill run through him. Are you the deputy? Bram Ellington? No, but I was there. Long time ago. Who are you? The phone stayed silent for a long moment, then, doesn't matter. Just don't cross at night. Not Portage. Not in winter. The bridge remembers. Orrin typed furiously. Remembers what? What happened to Mavis? She waited, and waiting was the mistake. The phone went silent. Orrin waited for another message, but nothing came. He tried calling the number, but it went straight to a generic voicemail that wouldn't accept messages. He sat in the cab staring at the screen, his mind racing. Someone who knows. Someone who was there. That meant someone who'd experienced the same thing Orrin had. Someone who'd encountered whatever haunted that control house and lived to warn others. Orrin made a decision. He wasn't going back across Portage Bridge. Not today, not in the dark. He'd take the long route, the inland highway that looped north around the bay. It would add 3 hours to his trip, but he didn't care. He'd seen enough. He pulled out of the warehouse lot and headed north, away from the coast. The sky was darkening again, clouds rolling in from the west, and by the time he reached the inland highway, the first flurries were starting to fall. He drove through the afternoon and into the evening, the snow getting heavier as the new storm system moved in. But the road was well maintained, and traffic was light. He made steady progress, and by 7 o'clock he was past the bay and heading back toward the coast. He was 50 miles west of Portage Bridge when his phone rang. Unknown number. The same one that had texted him earlier. Orrin answered immediately. Hello? A voice. Old and tired, male. You took the long route. Good. Who is this? Orrin demanded. Name's not important. What's important is you listened. Most don't. You know what's happening at that bridge. Tell me. The voice sighed, a long, weary sound. I was a trucker. Like you. Crossed Portage on a November night in 1987. Storm rolled in, bridge barriers went down, and I got stuck waiting. I went to the control house to see what was happening. Found the tender there. Woman named... Hell, I can't remember her name now. But she was standing at the controls, not moving. Just like that deputy you saw. Mavis O'Rourke, Orrin said quietly. That's it. Yeah. Mavis. I tried to help her, but when I touched her shoulder, she turned around and looked at me, and I knew. I knew she wasn't alive, hadn't been for a long time. What did you do? Ran. Got in my rig and drove. Didn't stop until I hit Wisconsin. Sold the rig a month later, quit trucking, and never went back. But I kept tabs on that bridge. Every few years, someone reports something strange. Barriers going down on their own. Voices on the CB. Figures standing on the deck. Always in winter. Always when there's a storm. Why? Orrin asked. Why does it keep happening? Because she's still waiting. Mavis. Still working that shift. Waiting for relief that never came. And the bridge, it's like it recorded her. Trapped her in that moment. And every time conditions match that night in 58, storm, cold, isolation, it plays back, like a loop. Orrin felt his chest tighten. So she's, what, a ghost? Call it what you want. Ghost, echo, residual energy. Doesn't matter. What matters is she's stuck. And if you stay too long, if you try to interact with her, you get stuck too. Not physically, but mentally. You become part of the loop. I've heard of people who crossed at night and never recovered. They kept talking about shift changes and barrier malfunctions, like they couldn't break free from it. The deputy, Orrin said. Bram Ellington, is he? Probably fine. If you pulled him out quick enough. But he'll remember. And it'll haunt him. Orrin looked out at the dark highway. The snow swirling in his headlights. Why are you telling me this? Because you listened. Because you turned back. Most people don't. Most people think they can handle it, or they don't believe what they're seeing. But you trusted your instincts, and that's rare. Is there anything that can be done? For Mavis? The voice was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. Maybe when they tear down the bridge, she'll be released. Or maybe she'll just move somewhere else. All I know is that bridge is dangerous, and people need to stay away from it after dark. I won't go back, Orrin said. Good. And if you know any other drivers who use that route, warn them. Tell them to take the inland road at night. It could save their life. Or their mind. The line went dead. Orrin lowered the phone and stared at the highway ahead. The snow was falling harder now, and the wipers struggled to keep up. But he felt strangely calm. He had answers, or at least enough of them to understand what he'd encountered. Mavis O'Rourke was still on that bridge, still working her shift, still waiting for someone to relieve her. And, until that bridge came down, she'd be there every winter, every storm, replaying the same night over and over. Orrin drove on through the snow, putting more distance between himself and Portage Bridge. He didn't know if he believed in ghosts, not really, but he believed in what he'd seen, and he believed in the voice on the phone, the warning from someone who'd survived the same experience. He wouldn't cross Portage Bridge at night again, and he'd make sure other drivers knew to avoid it too. It was the least he could do for Mavis O'Rourke, a woman who'd died waiting for someone who never came. The storm followed him west, but Orrin didn't mind. He had warmth, light, and the steady hum of the engine. And most importantly, he had distance. Distance from that bridge and the lonely figure trapped within its control house. As midnight approached, Orrin pulled into a truck stop and parked for the night. He climbed into the sleeper, pulled the curtains closed, and tried to rest. But before he closed his eyes, he looked at his phone one last time. The unknown number had sent one final message. Thank you for listening. Not many do. Be safe out there. Orrin typed a reply. You too, and thank you. He didn't know if the message would be read, or if the person on the other end would ever contact him again. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd survived, and he'd learned something important. Some bridges aren't just structures. Some bridges are monuments to the people who died there. And Portage Bridge was Mavis O'Rourke's monument. A cold, lonely place where she'd wait forever unless someone found a way to set her free. Orrin closed his eyes and let sleep take him. And for the first time since encountering that bridge, he didn't dream of control houses or figures in the snow. He dreamed of dawn and open roads and the promise of home. 3 weeks passed before Orrin had to drive through the Lake Superior region again. He'd taken jobs that kept him south and west, hauling freight through Wisconsin and Minnesota, but always avoiding the coastal routes. The dispatcher had noticed. She'd called him twice asking why he kept requesting alternative assignments, and Orrin had given vague answers about preferring inland highways during winter months. She hadn't pressed the issue, but he could hear the skepticism in her voice. The truth was, he couldn't stop thinking about Portage Bridge. About Mavis O'Rourke standing in that control house, trapped in an endless loop of waiting. About the deputy's blank expression and the figure on the bridge pointing at him through the snow. And most of all, about the anonymous caller's warning. If you stay too long, you become part of the loop. Orrin had done more research in those 3 weeks. He'd found old county records online, news archives, even a few forum posts from other truckers who'd had strange experiences at Portage Bridge. The stories were remarkably consistent. Barriers going down without explanation. Voices on CB radios reporting shift changes and mechanical problems. Figures standing on the bridge deck in vintage work clothes. All of it happening in winter, during storms, late at night. One post had particularly caught his attention. It was from a user named Lake Hauler 73, posted 6 years ago. Crossed Portage at 2 a.m. during a blizzard. Barriers were down, but deck was clear. Went to control house to check. Found it empty, but heard someone moving around upstairs. Building only has 1 floor. Got out of there fast. Anyone else experience this? The replies were a mix of skepticism and confirmation. Some people dismissed it as paranoia or fatigue. Others shared similar stories, dating back to the early 2000s, the 90s, even the 80s. Always the same bridge. Always winter. Always at night. Orrin had saved the forum thread and read it multiple times, looking for patterns. He noticed that encounters seemed to increase in November, around the anniversary of Mavis O'Rourke's disappearance, and they always involved people who stopped at the bridge for an extended period. Quick crossings, even at night, rarely resulted in anything more than a feeling of unease. But anyone who lingered, who tried to investigate or wait out a closure, reported much more intense experiences. Now, in mid-December, Orrin had a problem. The company had a contract for a rush delivery to Sault Ste. Marie, and with several drivers out sick with flu, he was the only one available who knew the route. The dispatcher had been clear. This wasn't optional. The client was paying premium rates for overnight delivery, and the company needed someone reliable. Orrin had tried to negotiate. Could he take the inland route and arrive in the morning instead? No, the dispatcher said. The delivery window was 6 to 8 a.m., and the inland route would get him there too late. Could someone else take it? No, everyone else was either already on assignment or lacked the necessary certifications for the cargo, medical equipment that required special handling. So Orrin had accepted the job, knowing exactly what it meant. He'd be driving the coastal route at night, in December, with Portage Bridge directly in his path. His only consolation was that the weather forecast looked clear. No storms predicted, just cold and calm. Maybe, he thought, if conditions didn't match that night in 1958, nothing would happen. Maybe he could cross without incident. He left at 4 p.m., giving himself plenty of buffer time. The rig was loaded with hospital equipment. Imaging machines, surgical tools, monitoring devices, all of it worth more than Oren's annual salary. He'd done the pre-trip inspection twice, checking every strap and seal, making sure nothing could shift in transit. The drive started smoothly. The sun set around 5:30, and Oren continued east into the darkness, his headlights cutting through the night. The roads were clear and dry, the temperature hovering just below freezing. He made good time, stopping once for fuel and a quick bathroom break, then pushing on toward the coast. He reached the Lake Superior shoreline around 8 p.m. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the frozen landscape. The lake stretched out to his right, vast and dark, with ice formations along the shore that glittered in the moonlight. It was beautiful in a stark, lonely way, the kind of beauty that reminded you how small and insignificant you were in the face of nature's scale. Oren turned on the CB, keeping the volume low, listening to the scattered chatter of other truckers on the road. Most of it was mundane: weather reports, traffic updates, complaints about dispatchers and tight schedules. Normal, grounding. He let the voices wash over him, a reminder that he wasn't alone out here. At 9:15 he saw the sign, Portage Bridge, 5 miles. His hands tightened on the wheel. This was it. In 5 minutes he'd be approaching the bridge. In daylight he'd crossed it without serious incident, just the words in the snow and the voice on the CB. At night, though, that was when things got dangerous. That was when Mavis O'Rourke's presence was strongest. Oren checked the time, 9:17 p.m. If he maintained his current speed, he'd reach the bridge around 9:22. Cross it in 2 minutes, maybe 3. Be on the other side by 9:25, quick and clean. No lingering, no stopping, no investigating. Just drive across and keep going. The CB crackled. Eastbound traffic, be advised, Portage Bridge is clear, all systems normal. A standard traffic update. Nothing unusual. Oren keyed the handset. Copy that. This is eastbound commercial approaching Portage. Any other traffic in the area? Silence. Then, negative, eastbound. You're the only one showing on this stretch. Roads are quiet tonight. Copy. Thanks. Oren hung up the handset and focused on the road. He could see the glow of the bridge lights now, a faint yellow haze above the tree line. His pulse was starting to quicken, his breathing getting shallow. He forced himself to stay calm. It was just a bridge, steel and concrete, nothing more. He crested the hill and the bridge came into full view. The barriers were up. The deck was level. The control house sat at the center of the span, its windows dark, just like they should be at this hour. Everything looked normal, exactly as it should. Oren eased the rig down the approach, his speed dropping to 40, then 35. The deck was clear, no ice visible, no obstacles. The moonlight made everything look surreal, casting sharp shadows from the bridge's framework that stretched across the roadway like dark fingers. He was 50 feet from the bridge entrance when the CB crackled again. Shift change at midnight. Oren's blood ran cold. The voice was faint, threaded with static, but unmistakable. The same flat, procedural tone he'd heard 3 weeks ago. Mavis O'Rourke, logging her shift notes into the void. He grabbed the handset, his heart pounding. "Who is this? Identify yourself." The voice continued, ignoring him. "Barrier malfunction logged. Awaiting maintenance. Deck inspection incomplete. Oren's eyes darted to the control house. The windows were still dark. No lights, no movement, but the voice on the CB was clear, getting stronger as he approached the bridge. He had a choice. He could stop, turn around, refuse to cross, take the inland route and deal with the consequences. A late delivery, an angry client, maybe even a reprimand from the company. Or he could push forward, cross quickly, and hope that speed would protect him from whatever haunted this bridge. Oren made his decision. He pressed down on the accelerator and drove onto the bridge. The moment the front tires touched the deck, the temperature in the cab dropped. Not gradually, but instantly, like someone had opened a freezer door. Oren could see his breath fogging in front of his face, and frost began forming on the inside of the windshield. The heater was still running full blast, but it made no difference. The cold was absolute, invasive, seeping into his bones. The CB hissed and crackled, the voice becoming clearer. Relief scheduled for 0800. Conditions deteriorating. Wind from the northwest at 30 knots. Oren kept his eyes on the road ahead, forcing himself not to look at the control house as he passed. But in his peripheral vision, he could see lights. The windows were glowing now, that same flickering yellow he'd seen before. And through the glass, shadows moved. Multiple figures, pacing back and forth inside the small building. Not real, Oren muttered to himself. Just echoes, not real. The voice on the CB shifted, the tone becoming more urgent. Cannot leave post. Waiting for relief. Procedure requires... Oren was halfway across now. The control house was directly to his right, maybe 20 feet away. He could see the shadows more clearly now, and his stomach twisted. They weren't just pacing. They were gathering at the windows, pressing against the glass, watching his rig pass. And then, impossibly, he heard a knock. 3 sharp raps against the passenger door of his cab. Oren's head snapped to the right. There was nothing there. Just the dark expanse of the bay and the ice-covered water below. But the knock came again. 3 times. Deliberate, insistent. The CB voice fragmented, multiple voices overlapping now. Shift change, midnight, waiting. Relief never came. Cold, so cold, can't leave. Procedure. Oren's hands were shaking on the wheel. He wanted to floor it, race off this bridge at maximum speed, but he forced himself to maintain a steady pace. Sudden acceleration on icy bridge decks was a recipe for disaster. He had to stay calm, stay controlled. 3/4 across now. The far end of the bridge was visible ahead, the solid ground beyond it a promise of safety. Oren focused on that point, on the road that led away from this place, and tried to block out everything else. But then the CB went silent. Complete dead air. And in that silence, Oren heard something else, a voice. Not from the radio, but from inside the cab. A woman's voice, tired and resigned. You shouldn't have come. Oren's breath caught. He looked around the cab, but there was no one there. He was alone. Completely alone. The voice came again, seeming to originate from everywhere and nowhere. I tried to warn you. The barrier should have been down. Mavis, Oren whispered. I can't hold them much longer. The others. They want to show you what happened. They want you to understand. Hold who? Oren asked, his voice shaking. What others? The ones who stayed too long. The ones who couldn't leave. They're angry. They don't understand why I keep warning people away. They think if others join us, we won't be so alone. Oren reached the far end of the bridge and felt the tires hit solid ground. The temperature in the cab immediately began to rise. The frost on the windshield started to melt. The voice faded, becoming fainter. Don't come back, Mavis said, her words barely audible now. I can't protect you if you come back. Then she was gone. The cab was warm again, the CB crackling back to life with normal traffic chatter. Orrin pulled over at the first turnout and killed the engine, his entire body shaking. He sat in the darkness trying to process what had just happened. Mavis O'Rourke had spoken to him, not through the CB, not through whispers in a control house, but directly. As if she'd been sitting right next to him in the cab. And she'd said she'd been trying to warn him, trying to protect him from the others. The others? Orrin thought about the shadows in the control house, the figures on the bridge deck. How many people had gotten trapped there over the years? How many had stopped to investigate, to help, to wait out a storm, and never left? He pulled out his phone, hands still trembling, and called the anonymous number that had warned him before. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. Orrin waited for the beep. "This is Orrin Kepler. I just crossed Portage at night. I need to talk to you. I need to understand what's happening there. Call me back. Please." He hung up and stared at the phone, willing it to ring. But it stayed silent. He waited 5 minutes, then 10. Nothing. Orrin started the engine and pulled back onto the highway. He had a delivery to make, a schedule to keep. But his mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he'd experienced. Mavis had said she couldn't hold them much longer. The others. Which meant there was some kind of conflict happening on that bridge, between Mavis and the other trapped souls. She was trying to warn people away, trying to prevent more people from joining them. But the others wanted company, wanted to share their fate. The thought was terrifying. Not just that people could get trapped on that bridge, but that there was an active force trying to trap them, trying to pull them into that endless loop of waiting and cold and isolation. Orrin drove through the night, checking his mirrors obsessively, half expecting to see the figure in vintage work clothes standing on the roadside, watching him pass. But the road stayed empty. He reached Sault Ste. Marie at 5:47 a.m. earlier than expected, and made his delivery without incident. The warehouse supervisor signed the paperwork and chatted briefly about the cold weather, oblivious to what Orrin had just gone through. Orrin smiled and nodded, making the appropriate responses, but his mind was elsewhere. On the bridge. On Mavis. On the others who were trapped there. After the delivery was complete, Orrin sat in his cab and made a decision. He needed to know more, needed to understand the full history of that bridge and everyone who'd disappeared there. If Mavis was trapped, if others were trapped with her, maybe there was something that could be done. Maybe there was a way to free them. He spent the day in Sault Ste. Marie, catching a few hours of sleep in a motel, then visiting the local library when it opened at noon. The librarian, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a kind smile, directed him to the local history section. Orrin started with newspaper archives, searching for anything related to Portage Bridge. He found the article about Mavis O'Rourke's disappearance, which he'd already read online, but he also found others, older ones. In 1963, 5 years after Mavis vanished, a maintenance worker named Gerald Thorne had disappeared while inspecting the bridge during a winter storm. His tools were found on the deck, but he was never seen again. In 1979, a stranded motorist named Helen Voss had abandoned her broken-down car near the bridge approach. She'd been seen walking toward the control house, presumably seeking help. She was never found, and her car remained at the turnout for weeks before being towed. In '91, a bridge tender named Frank Desmond had reported strange occurrences during his night shifts. Voices on the radio, shadows in the control house, mechanical malfunctions that couldn't be explained. He'd quit after 3 weeks. 6 months later, he'd returned to the bridge one night, telling his family he needed to check something. He never came home. His truck was found parked at the bridge approach the next morning. The pattern was clear. Every few years, someone disappeared near Portage Bridge. Always in winter. Always at night. Always during or after a storm. And the bridge's reputation had grown slowly, passed through local folklore and trucker networks, a place to avoid after dark. Orrin printed out the articles and added them to his research folder. As he was leaving the library, his phone rang. The anonymous number, he answered immediately. "Hello? You crossed it." The voice was the same as before, old, tired, male. But this time there was something else in it. Fear. "Yeah, last night. And Mavis spoke to me inside my cab." A long pause. She's never done that before. At least, not that I've heard. That means things are getting worse. She said she couldn't hold the others much longer, that they want to trap more people. "Jesus," the man muttered. "I was afraid of this. The bridge is dying. They're planning to demolish it next spring, replace it with a modern span. The trapped souls know it, and they're getting desperate." Desperate how? They're afraid that when the bridge comes down, they'll be scattered, lost. So they're trying to anchor themselves by adding more people to the loop. More souls trapped means more weight, more presence. Harder to dislodge when the structure collapses. Orrin felt sick. So, what do we do? How do we stop it? I don't know if we can. I've been thinking about this for 30 years, ever since I encountered Mavis. I've read everything I could find about hauntings, residual energy, all that paranormal stuff. And the consensus seems to be that spirits tied to physical locations can only be freed when the location is destroyed, or when whatever's keeping them there is resolved. So, demolishing the bridge might actually free them. Maybe. Or it might trap them permanently. There's no way to know. Orrin sat in his truck, staring at the library building. What about Mavis? What's keeping her there? You said she's waiting for relief. What if we gave her that relief? What do you mean? What if someone went to that control house on the anniversary of her disappearance and told her she could leave, that her shift was over, that she'd done her job and it was time to go home? The man was silent for a long moment. That's either brilliant or insane. I'm not sure which. November 14th, Orrin said. That's when she disappeared. That's 11 months away. You're talking about going back there, at night, during a storm, on the exact date when the bridge is most active. That's suicide. Maybe. But what if it works? What if all she needs is permission to leave? Someone to tell her it's okay that she's not abandoning her post? And the others? Gerald Thorne, Helen Voss, Frank Desmond, all the rest? What about them? Orrin hadn't thought of that. I don't know. Maybe if Mavis leaves, they can too. Maybe she's the anchor holding them all there. Or maybe they'll be so angry that someone's trying to take her away that they'll kill you before you can finish. You saw how they reacted to you just passing through. Imagine what they'd do if you actually tried to interfere. Orrin rubbed his face. The man was right. It was dangerous, possibly fatal. But the alternative was doing nothing, letting the bridge be demolished with all those souls still trapped inside, desperate and afraid. I need to think about this, Orrin said finally. But thank you for warning me, for calling back. I know you're risking something by helping me. Just be careful, the man said. I've lived with the memory of that night for 30 years. I don't want to add you to the list of people who disappeared at Portage Bridge. He hung up. Orrin sat in the truck stop parking lot as the sun set, watching the sky turn from blue to orange to deep purple. He had 11 months to decide, 11 months to prepare, and if he chose to go through with it, 11 months to figure out how to free a woman who'd been waiting for relief for 67 years. The road stretched out ahead of him, dark and uncertain. But Orrin knew one thing for certain. He couldn't just walk away from this. couldn't just avoid the bridge and pretend he didn't know what was happening there. Mavis O'Rourke had tried to protect him, had warned him away even while the others tried to trap him. She deserved better than to spend eternity trapped in that control house, endlessly waiting for a shift change that would never come. And if there was a chance, even a small one, that Orrin could help her, he had to try. He started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, heading west toward home. The road was long and dark, but for the first time in weeks, Orrin felt something other than fear. He felt purpose. The months crawled by with agonizing slowness. Orrin continued hauling freight across the Midwest, but he avoided the Lake Superior routes entirely now. Every job he took, every mile he drove, his mind was working on the problem of Portage Bridge. He read everything he could find about hauntings, residual energy, and spirits tied to locations. Most of it was speculation and folklore, but certain themes kept appearing: unfinished business, strong emotional attachments, dramatic deaths, and the power of ritual and intention. By March, Orrin had developed a plan. He'd returned to Portage Bridge on November 14th, the anniversary of Mavis O'Rourke's disappearance. He'd wait until conditions matched that night in 1958 as closely as possible. Late evening, cold, preferably during a storm. Then he'd go to the control house and speak to Mavis directly, giving her permission to leave her post, to abandon the shift that had trapped her for nearly 7 decades. But he wouldn't go alone. The anonymous caller, who'd eventually identified himself as Raymond, a retired trucker living in Wisconsin, had agreed to help. They'd spoken on the phone a dozen times over the spring and summer, comparing notes, refining the approach. Raymond was convinced that Orrin's plan had merit, but he was also terrified of what might happen if the other trapped souls interfered. "You need to understand something," Raymond had said during one of their calls. "Mavis is the strongest presence on that bridge because she was the first. She's been there the longest and her attachment is the deepest. But the others, Gerald, Helen, Frank, and whoever else is trapped there, they're desperate. They've been isolated for years, some for decades. If they think you're trying to take Mavis away from them, they'll fight back." "How?" Orrin had asked. "What can they actually do?" "I don't know exactly. But Frank Desmond went back to that bridge voluntarily, remember? He quit his job because of what he experienced there, but something pulled him back. Something convinced him to return, and he never left. That tells me they have some kind of influence, some way of manipulating people's thoughts or decisions." The thought had haunted Orrin. What if he got to the bridge and found himself unable to leave? What if the voices and the cold and the overwhelming sense of isolation convinced him to stay, to join them in their endless vigil? By October, Orrin had made his preparations. He'd filed for a week of personal time starting November 13th. He'd stocked his rig with supplies: extra food, water, blankets, a portable heater, flares, and a satellite phone with GPS tracking. He'd written letters to his sister and his ex-wife, sealed them, and left them with Raymond with instructions to mail them if he didn't return by November 16th. He'd also done something else. He'd tracked down Mavis O'Rourke's family. It hadn't been easy. Most of her immediate relatives were dead, and those who remained had scattered across the country. But he'd finally located a nephew, Thomas O'Rourke, living in a nursing home in Green Bay. Thomas was 91 years old, his memory fading, but he remembered his Aunt Mavis clearly. She was kind, Thomas had told Orrin during their phone conversation. Responsible. She took that job seriously, you know. Bridge tender wasn't glamorous work, but she treated it like it mattered. She'd tell us stories about the ships that came through, the crews she'd talked to on the radio. She loved that bridge. "Do you know what happened to her?" Orrin had asked gently. "No, nobody does. The police investigated, but there was nothing. No body, no evidence. She just vanished, My mother, Mavis's sister, always believed something had happened on that bridge. An accident, maybe, or foul play. But there was never any proof. If you could tell Mavis something now, what would it be? Thomas had been quiet for a long moment. I'd tell her we missed her, that we never forgot her, and that it's okay to rest now. She doesn't have to keep working, she can come home. Orrin had written down those words, Thomas's exact phrasing. He'd committed them to memory, rehearsing them over and over. Because when he stood in that control house and spoke to Mavis O'Rourke, those were the words he'd use. Words from her family, releasing her from her duty. November 14th arrived cold and clear. Orrin had hoped for a storm, for conditions that would match 1958. But the weather forecast showed nothing more than light winds and temperatures in the 20s. He'd considered waiting for worse weather, but Raymond had talked him out of it. The anniversary is what matters, Raymond had said. The date itself has power. That's when her presence will be strongest, when she'll be most able to hear you and respond. Don't wait for perfect conditions. Just go. So Orrin had loaded his rig with a false cargo, empty pallets and crates, enough weight to make the trip look legitimate if anyone checked, and headed east from his apartment in Minneapolis. Raymond was driving up from Wisconsin, planning to meet Orrin at a truck stop 10 miles west of the bridge at 8 p.m. They'd approach together, 2 rigs instead of 1, hoping that mutual support would provide some protection against whatever waited on that span. The drive east was uneventful. Orrin listened to music, to podcasts, to anything that would keep his mind occupied and prevent him from overthinking what he was about to do. But as the sun set and he entered the Lake Superior region, the nervousness kicked in. His hands were sweaty on the wheel, and his stomach churned with anxiety. He reached the designated truck stop at 7:47 p.m. Raymond's rig was already there, parked under bright fluorescent lights near the building. Orrin pulled in beside it and killed his engine. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at Raymond's truck. This was real. This was actually happening. In less than an hour, he'd be standing in that control house, trying to free a woman who'd been dead for 67 years. He climbed out of his cab and walked over to Raymond's rig. The older man was already stepping down, moving slowly and stiffly. He was in his 70s now, gray-haired and weathered, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "You ready for this?" Raymond asked. "No," Orrin admitted. "But I don't think I'll ever be ready, so we might as well go." Raymond nodded. "I've been thinking about this day for 30 years. Part of me never believed it would actually come, but here we are." They went into the truck stop and got coffee, sitting at a booth near the window where they could see their rigs. Other truckers came and went, oblivious to what Orrin and Raymond were planning. Normal people going about their normal jobs, while 2 men prepared to confront the supernatural on a frozen bridge. At 8:30, they paid their bills and walked back to the rigs. The temperature had dropped into the teens, and their breath bogged in the cold air. The sky was clear, stars visible between scattered clouds, and the moon was waning but still bright enough to cast shadows. "Remember the plan," Raymond said. "We park before the bridge approach, walk in together, and you do the talking. I'm there for support, nothing more. If things go wrong, if we feel threatened, we leave immediately. No heroics." "Understood," Orrin said. They climbed into their respective rigs and pulled out of the truck stop in convoy, Raymond leading. The road to Portage Bridge was dark and empty, no other traffic visible. As they drove, Orrin kept his eyes on Raymond's taillights, using them as a focal point to keep his mind from spiraling into fear. They reached the bridge approach at 8:52 p.m. Raymond pulled over at the same turnout where Orrin had stopped months ago, and Orrin parked behind him. They killed their engines and climbed out, the sudden silence oppressive after hours of road noise. The bridge stretched ahead of them, illuminated by regularly spaced lights along its length. The control house sat at the center, dark and silent. The bay below was partially frozen, sheets of ice extending from both shores with open water visible in the middle. Everything looked normal. Peaceful, even. "You feel anything?" Raymond asked quietly. Oren concentrated. There was something in the air, a tension or expectancy that he couldn't quite name, but nothing overtly threatening. Not yet. "It's still early. Mavis disappeared around midnight, according to the reports. We might need to wait." They decided to wait in Raymond's rig, which had a more comfortable sleeper cab and a better heater. They climbed in and settled onto the bunk, speaking in low voices, comparing observations and steeling their nerves. At 9:30, the temperature began to drop. Not outside. Inside the cab. Raymond noticed it first, his breath suddenly visible. He reached for the heater controls, but before he could adjust them, Oren grabbed his arm. "Don't. It's starting." They watched in silence as frost began to form on the windows, spreading in delicate patterns from the edges toward the center. Outside, the bridge lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. And in the distance, barely visible, a yellow glow appeared in the control house windows. "She's here," Oren whispered. They climbed out of the cab and stood beside the rig, staring at the bridge. The control house lights were steady now, that same flickering yellow Oren had seen before. And as they watched, a figure appeared in one of the windows, tall and indistinct, moving back and forth inside the small building. "Time to go," Raymond said, his voice tight with fear. They walked toward the bridge, their boots crunching in the snow that had accumulated on the shoulder. As they approached the entrance, Oren felt the air grow colder, denser, like they were walking into a wall of ice. His lungs ached with each breath, and his exposed skin burned from the cold. The CB in Raymond's rig crackled to life behind them, the sound carrying clearly in the still air. "Shift change at midnight, waiting for relief, deck inspection incomplete," Mavis's voice repeating her logs. Oren forced himself to keep walking. They stepped onto the bridge deck, and immediately the world changed. The modern highway lights dimmed, their illumination seeming to recede, and in their place, older lights appeared. Incandescent bulbs and vintage fixtures, casting a yellower, harsher glow. The bridge framework looked different too, less weathered, the paint fresher, the metal less corroded. "We're seeing it as it was," Raymond breathed, "in 1958. They walked toward the control house, each step an effort against the cold and the growing sense of wrongness. Oren could hear sounds now, wind howling through the bridge framework, though the air was still, ice creaking and groaning, though the bay was only partially frozen. And underneath it all, whispers. Multiple voices, overlapping and unintelligible. They were 20 feet from the control house when the door opened. A woman stepped out. She was in her 40s, wearing a heavy coat and a knit cap, her face pale but composed. Mavis O'Rourke, looking exactly as she had in the 1958 photograph Oren had found. She looked at them without surprise, as if she'd been expecting them. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice clear but distant, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "It's not safe. The others are agitated tonight." "We came to help you," Oren said, his voice shaking from cold and fear. "We came to tell you that you can leave." Mavis shook her head slowly. "I can't leave. I'm waiting for my relief. Procedure requires—" "Your relief isn't coming," Oren interrupted gently. "It's been 67 years, Mavis. November 14th, 1958 was the last night you worked. You've been waiting all this time, but you don't have to anymore." She stared at him, confusion crossing her pale features. 67 years? That's not... I've only been here for a few hours. It's still November 14th. For you, yes. But for the rest of the world, decades have passed. Your family is gone, Mavis. But I spoke to your nephew Thomas before his memory started to fade. He asked me to tell you something. Mavis's eyes widened slightly. Thomas? Little Thomas? He's 91 now, and he wanted you to know that your family missed you, that they never forgot you, and that it's okay to rest now. You don't have to keep working. You can come home. For a moment, something shifted in Mavis's expression. A flicker of recognition, of understanding, of hope. But then her face hardened, and she shook her head violently. No, I can't. If I leave, who will operate the bridge? Who will manage the shifts? The procedure is clear. The bridge doesn't need you anymore, Raymond said, speaking for the first time. I'm sorry, Mavis, but you died that night. You've been trapped here ever since, replaying the same shift over and over. But you can stop now. You can let go. The control house door slammed open, and more figures emerged. 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, all wearing clothing from different eras. Orrin recognized them from his research. Gerald Thorne in his maintenance coveralls from the 60s, Helen Voss in her 70s-era parka, and Frank Desmond in a 90s-style bridge tender uniform. They moved to stand behind Mavis, their faces expressionless, their eyes glassy and unfocused. But there was hostility in their postures, a clear message. Leave her alone. You can't have her, Gerald said, his voice flat and mechanical. She's ours. We need her. She's the only thing keeping us together, Helen added. If she leaves, we'll scatter. We'll be alone. You're already alone, Orrin said, trying to keep his voice steady. All of you are trapped in your own moments, your own traumas. Mavis is trapped waiting for relief. Gerald, you're trapped in whatever happened during your inspection. Helen, Frank, the same. You're not really together. You're just haunting the same space. Shut up, Frank snarled, his face twisting with anger. You don't know what it's like, the cold, the silence, the endless waiting. At least, when we're near each other, we're not completely alone. If Mavis leaves, that connection breaks. Then leave with her, Raymond said. All of you. Whatever's keeping you here, let it go. Find peace. The 3 figures laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed across the frozen bay. Peace, Gerald said. We tried to leave. We can't. We're bound to this bridge, to our deaths. The only way we could ever escape is if... He stopped abruptly, and all 3 figures turned their heads in unison, looking at something behind Orrin and Raymond. The 2 men spun around. Standing on the bridge deck, blocking their path back to the rigs, was another figure. This one was different from the others. Larger, more solid-looking, and radiating a palpable sense of malevolence. It wore a heavy coat and a foreman's hat, and its face was twisted in a permanent expression of rage. That's not possible, Raymond whispered. That's Callahan, Mavis said quietly. The construction foreman. He died during the bridge building in 1953. He was the first. The figure, Callahan, began walking toward them, each step deliberate and threatening. You shouldn't have come here, it said, its voice like grinding metal. This bridge is mine. These souls are mine. And now you'll join them. Orrin felt panic rising in his chest. This was worse than he'd imagined. Not just trapped souls looking for companionship, but something darker, something actively malevolent. A spirit that didn't just haunt the bridge, it claimed it, owned it. Run, Raymond said urgently. Run now. But before they could move, the bridge itself seemed to respond. The deck beneath their feet tilted slightly, throwing them off balance. The framework groaned and creaked, sounds that shouldn't be possible from a stable structure. And the temperature dropped even further, so cold that Orrin felt his lungs seizing, unable to draw breath. Mavis stepped forward, positioning herself between them and Callahan. "No," she said firmly. "You can't have them. They came to help, not to harm." Callahan's expression twisted further. "You dare defy me? I made you what you are. I gave you purpose. Without me, you're nothing." "You didn't make me," Mavis said, her voice growing stronger. "You trapped me. You and this cursed bridge. I stayed because I thought it was my duty, my responsibility. But it wasn't. It was your manipulation, your need to collect souls to feed your anger." She turned to face Orrin and Raymond, and for the first time, her expression was clear and focused. "You were right. I can leave. I should have left 67 years ago, but I was afraid. Afraid of abandoning my post, afraid of failing in my duty. Callahan used that fear to trap me here." "Don't listen to her," Gerald said desperately. "Mavis, if you leave, we'll fade. We need you." "No," Mavis said gently. "You need to let go too, all of you. Callahan has been lying to us, telling us we're bound here forever. But we're not. We're only bound by our own fear and guilt and unfinished business, and that can be released." She looked at Orrin. "Thomas really said I could come home?" Orrin nodded, tears freezing on his cheeks. "He did. Your family loved you, Mavis. They want you to rest." Mavis smiled, a genuine expression that made her face look younger, more alive. "Then I'm going home. My shift is over." She turned and walked toward the edge of the bridge, toward the railing overlooking the frozen bay. Callahan roared and lunged toward her, but she was faster. She climbed onto the railing, balanced there for a moment, and looked back at the other trapped souls. "You can all leave too. Just let go. Stop replaying your deaths and choose to move on." Then she stepped off the railing and fell into the darkness below. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The bridge shuddered violently, and cracks appeared in the deck, spreading like lightning across the surface. The control house windows shattered, and the vintage lights exploded in the showers of sparks. Callahan screamed, a sound of pure fury and loss, and his form began to disintegrate, breaking apart like smoke in a strong wind. Gerald, Helen, and Frank stood frozen, watching as their anchor, Mavis, disappeared. Then, one by one, they too walked to the railing and climbed over. Not jumping so much as simply stepping through, as if passing from one room to another. The bridge continued to shake, and Orrin realized they needed to move. "Go!" he shouted to Raymond. "Get off the bridge!" They ran, slipping and stumbling on the fracturing deck, the framework groaning and screeching around them. Behind them, Callahan's scream faded to a whisper, then to nothing. The vintage lights winked out, replaced by modern highway illumination. The cold released its grip, and the air temperature returned to normal. They reached the end of the bridge and kept running, not stopping until they reached their rigs. Only then did they turn around, breathing hard, and look back at the span. The bridge looked normal, solid and stable, no cracks visible, no damage. The control house windows were intact. Everything appeared exactly as it should, but the lights in the control house were dark, and there was a quality to the air, a lightness, an absence, that hadn't been there before. "Did we?" Raymond couldn't finish the sentence. "I think we did," Orrin said quietly. "I think they're free." They stood in silence watching the bridge, waiting for some sign of what had happened. After 10 minutes, Orrin's phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. Thank you. That was all. Just 2 words. But Orrin knew who had sent it. He showed the message to Raymond, who nodded slowly. Mavis, Raymond said. She's saying goodbye. Orrin typed a reply. Rest well. Your shift is over. The message marked as delivered but never read, and somehow that felt right. They climbed into Raymond's rig and sat in the warm cab, processing what they'd experienced. Neither of them felt like driving yet, so they just sat, occasionally glancing at the bridge, making sure it was still there, still solid. What about Callahan? Raymond asked finally. Do you think he's gone too? I don't know, Orrin admitted. But I think when Mavis left, she broke his hold. He was feeding off the trapped souls, using them to anchor himself here. Without them, he had nothing left. So the bridge is clean now, free of ghosts. Maybe. Or maybe there are others we don't know about. But the main presences, Mavis and the others, I think they're gone. They sat for another hour, then decided it was safe to leave. Raymond started his engine and pulled onto the highway, heading west toward Wisconsin. Orrin followed in his own rig, taking one last look at Portage Bridge in his mirror. It looked smaller somehow, less imposing. Just a bridge, nothing more. Over the following weeks, Orrin kept watch on news from the region, looking for any reports of strange occurrences at Portage Bridge. But there was nothing. The bridge operated normally, the barriers functioning properly, no reports of voices or apparitions or unexplained cold spots. In February, he received a letter from Thomas O'Rourke's nursing home. Thomas had passed away peacefully in his sleep on November 15th, the day after Orrin had gone to the bridge. The letter included a note that Thomas had left, to be sent to Orrin in the event of his death. Thank you for finding my aunt and bringing her home. I dreamed about her the night before I died. She was young and happy, and she told me she was finally free. She asked me to tell you that you gave her a gift she thought she'd never have, the chance to rest. Thank you. Orrin folded the letter carefully and placed it in his research folder, along with all the articles and notes he'd collected about Portage Bridge. He didn't know if he'd ever drive past that bridge again. The state had announced that demolition was still scheduled for spring, and the new span would be operational by summer. When that new bridge opened, Orrin made a point of crossing it during the day. The structure was modern and efficient, all concrete and steel, with digital controls and automated barriers. No control house, no bridge tender, just sensors and computers managing the lift mechanism. As he drove across, Orrin looked down at the water below. The old bridge pilings were still visible, dark shapes beneath the surface. But there was no sense of presence, no feeling of being watched. Just water and ice, and the normal natural cold of a northern winter. He reached the far side and continued east, following his route to Sault Ste. Marie. The road stretched ahead, familiar and routine. And for the first time in a year, Orrin felt at peace. Mavis O'Rourke was home. Her endless shift was over. And somewhere, he hoped, she was resting in the warmth and light she'd been denied for so long. The bridge was just a bridge now, and that was exactly how it should be. The suspension bridge over the Red River looked like it was made of glass. That's what Deacon Hollis thought as he approached it just past midnight, his headlights catching the ice-covered roadway and turning it into a ribbon of polished obsidian. 23 years of trucking, and he'd never seen black ice quite like this. The bridge deck gleamed under the moonlight, smooth and reflective, almost beautiful in its treachery. Deacon had left Fargo 6 hours earlier with a load of agricultural equipment bound for a farm co-op outside Oklahoma City. The overnight route would put him there by dawn if he kept moving, and the pay was good enough that he'd volunteered for the run despite the weather forecast. Light, freezing rain, they'd said. Nothing he couldn't handle. But this wasn't light. This was a sheet of ice thick enough to see his own distorted reflection in the roadway as his rig crawled forward at 20 miles per hour. The suspension cables rose on either side like frozen spider silk, and the river below was invisible in the darkness. A void that seemed to swallow sound and light equally. Deacon was halfway across when he saw the other truck. It was ahead of him, maybe 300 feet, a big rig identical to his own in almost every way. Same model year, same color scheme, even the same style of trailer. It sat motionless in the right lane, hazard lights flashing in a slow hypnotic rhythm. No damage visible. No reason for it to be stopped in the middle of a bridge. Deacon keyed his CB. Eastbound truck on the Red River Bridge. You need assistance. Static. He tried again. This is westbound commercial approaching your position. Everything okay up there? Nothing, just the hiss of dead air. Deacon frowned and slowed further, bringing his rig down to 15 miles per hour. The ice made maneuvering treacherous, and he didn't want to risk sliding into the stopped vehicle. As he got closer, he could see more details. The truck's engine was running. He could see exhaust vapor rising from the stack, but there was no one in the cab. The driver's door was closed, windows dark. Deacon pulled up alongside, leaving plenty of space between the rigs, and set his air brakes. He grabbed his flashlight and climbed down carefully, his boots finding minimal purchase on the icy deck. The cold hit him immediately, a sharp wind blowing across the open expanse of the bridge that cut through his jacket like it wasn't there. He walked over to the other truck, his flashlight beam sweeping across the cab. Empty, definitely empty. But the keys were in the ignition, the engine idling smoothly, and a coffee cup sat in the holder, steam still rising from it. Fresh, very fresh. "Hello," Deacon called out, his voice swallowed by the wind. "Driver, you out here?" No response. He looked around the bridge deck, checking both directions. No footprints in the thin layer of snow and ice that had accumulated on the walkway. No sign that anyone had climbed out of the truck. Just the vehicle itself, running and warm, with no one inside. Deacon felt the first prickle of unease. He'd heard stories about drivers abandoning their rigs in strange circumstances, usually involving mental breakdowns or medical emergencies. But there would be signs. Footprints, blood, something. This was just empty. He was about to return to his own rig when he noticed something on the side mirror of the abandoned truck. Scratched into the frost that had formed on the glass were words. Fresh scratches, the ice still loose and powdery around the edges. "Turn back." Deacon's breath caught. He looked around again, more urgently this time, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The bridge stretched empty in both directions. The wind moaned through the suspension cables, a low, mournful sound that made his skin crawl. He walked to the front of the abandoned truck and checked the license plate, memorizing the number. Then he returned to his own rig, climbed inside, and locked the doors. His hands were shaking as he grabbed the CB handset. "This is westbound commercial on the Red River Bridge. I've got an abandoned vehicle here, engine running, no driver present, requesting state patrol assistance." A voice crackled back immediately. Male, professional, calm. "Copy that, westbound. Can you provide a description and plate number?" Deacon rattled off the details, including the message scratched in the mirror frost. There was a pause on the other end. "Say again on that last part? Message in the frost?" "Affirmative, 2 words. Turn back, looked fresh." Another pause, longer this time. "Westbound, this is State Trooper Vance Quill. I'm about 15 minutes from your location. Can you safely remain in your vehicle until I arrive?" "Yeah, I can wait, but there's something off about this whole situation." "Understood. Stay in your cab, keep your doors locked, and maintain radio contact. I'm en route." Deacon set the handset down and stared at the abandoned truck through his windshield. The hazard lights continued their slow flash, painting the ice-covered deck in amber pulses. And now that he was sitting still, looking more carefully, he noticed something else. There were marks on the ice. Not footprints, but drag marks. Long, parallel scratches in the black ice, leading from the abandoned truck toward the edge of the bridge, toward the railing. Deacon's stomach twisted. He climbed out again, moving carefully across the ice, and followed the marks with his flashlight. They led straight to the railing, then stopped. He looked over the edge, down into the darkness where the Red River flowed invisibly below. Nothing, just blackness and the sound of water moving under ice. He was backing away from the railing when he heard it. A voice, faint and distant, calling from somewhere on the bridge. "Help! Please!" Deacon spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Where are you? Call out again!" "Help me! I can't!" The voice was coming from ahead, from the far end of the bridge. Deacon started walking, then stopped. Something about this felt wrong. The voice was too clear, too perfectly audible despite the wind, and it kept repeating the same words, the same cadence, like a recording. He returned to his rig and grabbed the CB. "Trooper Quill, you copy?" "Go ahead, westbound. I'm hearing a voice calling for help from the far end of the bridge. Female voice, but something's not right about it." "Do not investigate," Quill said sharply. "Stay with your vehicle. I'm 10 minutes out." But Deacon couldn't just sit there. If someone was hurt, if they needed help, he had to at least check. He grabbed his heavy coat from the sleeper, pulled it on, and stepped back out into the cold. The voice continued to call, always from ahead, always just out of sight. Deacon walked forward, past the abandoned truck, following the sound. His flashlight beam swept across the bridge deck, illuminating the ice that stretched like dark glass beneath his feet. He was 100 feet past the abandoned truck when he saw the figure. It was standing near the center of the bridge, silhouetted against the ambient light from the far shore. Tall and thin, wearing what looked like a long coat. It wasn't moving, just standing there, facing him. "Hey!" Deacon called out. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move at all. Deacon walked closer, his boots slipping slightly on the ice, and that's when he realized something that made his blood freeze. The figure wasn't standing on the bridge deck. It was standing on the railing, balanced perfectly, impossibly, on the narrow metal bar that separated the roadway from the void below. Deacon stopped walking. "Sir? Ma'am? You need to come down from there. It's not safe." The figure turned its head slowly, looking at him. Even from 30 feet away, Deacon could see that something was wrong with its face. Too pale, too smooth, like a mannequin. And then it spoke, and the voice was the same one he'd been following. "Help me. I can't get down. I've been here so long." "How long?" Deacon asked, his voice shaking. He didn't know why he was engaging in conversation with this thing, but words kept coming. "How long have you been up there?" "Since the accident, since the ice, since I couldn't stop." Deacon's mind raced. An accident. Someone who'd crashed on this bridge, maybe gone over the railing. But that didn't explain why this figure was standing on the railing now, perfectly balanced, looking like it hadn't aged a day. Behind him, he heard the sound of an engine approaching. Headlights swept across the bridge, and a state patrol cruiser pulled up near Deacon's rig. A door opened and closed, and footsteps crunched on the ice. "Don't move," a voice called out. Trooper Quill, presumably, though Deacon didn't turn to look. He couldn't take his eyes off the figure on the railing. The trooper approached, flashlight in hand, and stopped beside Deacon. "Jesus," he breathed. "Is that?" You see it too? Deacon asked. Yeah, I see it. They stood in silence for a moment, both staring at the impossible figure balanced on the railing. Then Quill keyed his radio. Dispatch, I'm on scene at the Red River Bridge. I need you to pull any accident reports from this location. Go back 5 years, maybe 10, looking for fatalities. The radio crackled. Copy, stand by. The figure on the railing shifted slightly, its head tilting. Are you going to help me? We want to help, Quill called out, his voice steady and professional. But you need to come down from there first. Can you do that? I tried, I can't. Every time I try, I fall. And then I'm back here again, always back here. Deacon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Trooper, I think we need to leave. Right now. But before Quill could respond, his radio crackled again. Trooper Quill, I've got your information. 3 fatalities on the Red River Bridge in the past decade. 2 separate incidents. First was January 2019, single vehicle accident, driver lost control on black ice and went through the railing. Driver's name was Sarah Klein, age 34. Body recovered 3 days later downstream. Deacon and Quill exchanged a look. Second incident was November 2022. Trucker named Michael Strand stopped to help what he reported as a stranded motorist on the bridge. When backup arrived, they found Strand's truck abandoned, engine running, but no sign of Strand. He was never found. And the third fatality, Quill asked quietly. That was Strand, presumed dead after 6 months missing. But here's the thing, Trooper. Before he disappeared, he called in a report. Said he was seeing someone standing on the bridge railing. Said they were calling for help. The figure on the railing spoke again. I've been waiting for someone to help me down. But no one ever does. They try, and then they fall. And then I'm alone again. Deacon's hand moved to Quill's arm. We're not helping her down, we're leaving. Now. But as they turned to walk back to their vehicles, more figures appeared. They emerged from the shadows between the suspension cables, stepping out onto the deck one by one. 4 of them. 5. 6. All wearing different clothing from different eras, all standing impossibly still on the icy surface. They couldn't stop either, the figure on the railing said. The ice caught them, pulled them over, and now they wait with me. Deacon's heart was hammering in his chest. Trooper, do you have a weapon? Yeah, but I don't think it'll do much good against the dead. Then we run. They turned and ran, slipping and sliding on the ice back toward their vehicles. Behind them, Deacon could hear footsteps, slow and measured, following but not rushing, like the figures had all the time in the world. Deacon reached his rig first and yanked open the door. Quill was right behind him, heading for the patrol car. But as Deacon climbed into the cab, he saw something that made his stomach drop. The abandoned truck was gone. The roadway where it had been sitting was empty, just unbroken ice stretching across the bridge. Quill! Deacon shouted. The truck! I know, Quill yelled back. Just drive. Get off this bridge. Deacon didn't need to be told twice. He released the air brakes, shifted into gear, and pressed down on the accelerator as hard as he dared. The tires spun on the ice, then caught, and the rig lurched forward. In his mirror, he could see the figures standing in a line across the bridge deck, watching him leave. And standing in front of them, still balanced on the railing, was the woman who'd called for help. He didn't look back again. He just drove, following the patrol car's flashing lights, both of them racing across the remaining length of the bridge. The suspension cables flashed past like ribs in a skeleton, and then they were off, tires hitting solid asphalt, the bridge receding behind them. Quill pulled over a mile down the road, and Deacon followed. They both climbed out, breathing hard, and stood in the cold night air, staring back at the bridge in the distance. "What the hell was that?" Deacon asked. Quill shook his head. "I don't know, but I'm calling it in. That bridge needs to be closed, at least until we can investigate properly." "It won't matter," Deacon said quietly. "Those things, they're not going anywhere. They're stuck there, on that ice, and they're trying to drag others in to keep them company." Quill looked at him. "You believe that?" "I don't know what I believe anymore. But I know I'm never crossing that bridge again. Not at night, not in winter, not ever." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the distant lights of the bridge. Then Quill's radio crackled. "All units be advised. We're receiving multiple reports of an abandoned vehicle on the Red River Bridge. Caller says it's a semi-truck, engine running, no driver present." Deacon and Quill exchanged a look of horror. "That's impossible," Quill said. "We just left there. There was no truck." But Deacon knew better. He thought about the drag marks on the ice, about the figure on the railing saying it had been waiting so long, about Michael Strand who'd stopped to help and never left. The bridge was collecting people, drawing them in with cries for help, with abandoned vehicles, with anything that would make a decent person stop. And once you stopped, once you tried to help, the ice pulled you in. "We need to warn people," Deacon said. "We need to make sure no one else stops on that bridge." Quill nodded slowly. "I'll call it in. Recommend they post signs, warnings, maybe even close it during ice conditions. And if they don't..." Quill looked at the bridge again, at the lights reflecting off the ice-covered deck. "Then more people are going to disappear. And those figures are going to keep waiting, keep calling, keep trying to fill the loneliness." Deacon climbed back into his rig. His hands were still shaking, and he knew they'd be shaking for a long time. But he had a delivery to make, miles to cover, and a profound desire to be anywhere but here. As he pulled away, he looked in his side mirror one last time. The bridge stretched across the river, dark and gleaming, its ice-covered deck reflecting the moonlight like polished glass. And standing on the railing, barely visible in the distance, was a figure, watching him leave, waiting for the next person who'd be foolish enough to stop. Deacon pressed down on the accelerator and kept driving. He didn't stop until he reached the Oklahoma state line, where he pulled into a 24-hour truck stop and sat in the bright fluorescent light of the parking lot, surrounded by other trucks and other drivers and the comforting normalcy of the road. He called his dispatcher and explained that he'd need to take a different route on the return trip, any route that didn't cross the Red River Bridge. The dispatcher asked why, but Deacon couldn't explain. How do you tell someone that a bridge is haunted? That it collects souls like ice collects on cables? That stopping to help someone might mean you never leave? So he just said the ice was bad, and the dispatcher accepted that. Because ice was a reasonable concern. Ice was something normal people understood. But Deacon knew the truth. And he knew that somewhere on that bridge figures were still waiting, still calling for help, still hoping someone would stop. And he knew that as long as that ice remained, as long as winter came to the Red River, they'd keep waiting. Patient and cold and eternally hungry for company in their frozen vigil. The bridge remembered everyone who'd fallen, and it wanted more.